Hey friends, welcome back. If you're here tucked in, lights low, maybe a little tired from the day, I'm really glad you stopped by. Tonight we're not going on a vacation. We're not visiting a beautiful place with golden sunsets and ocean breezes. Tonight we're stepping into something much more real than that. We're stepping into a world that smelled like coal smoke and damp wood, and about 12 people cooking dinner at the same time in a space the size of your bathroom. So here's something I want you to sit with for just a second. Imagine you sold everything you owned, every piece of furniture, every coat, the little silver spoon your mother gave you on your wedding day. You packed what was left into a single bag, said goodbye to a village you had never once left in your entire life, and you got on a boat. Not a comfortable boat. A boat where you slept below the deck in the dark, packed in with hundreds of other people, who were all equally terrified and equally hopeful. The crossing took weeks. People got sick. Some didn't make it. But you did. And when the harbour came into view, when you saw that skyline rising out of the water like something out of a dream, you thought to yourself, we made it. This is the place. This is where everything changes. And then someone pointed you toward a street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and led you through a door that barely hung on its hinges, up a stairwell so narrow that two people couldn't pass each other, into a room, one single room, where a family of 7 already lived. And that is where tonight's story begins. But before we dive in, if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself drifting into these worlds alongside me, I would genuinely love it if you took a moment to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Not because a number on a screen matters to me, but because it tells me that what I'm doing here actually means something to someone out there. And hey, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching this from right now. Are you in bed, on the couch, maybe on a night shift somewhere, headphones in, keeping the world running while everyone else sleeps? I'd really love to know. Now turn the lights down just a little more if you can. Let a fan run softly in the background. Get comfortable. Because tonight's journey takes us somewhere that very few history books slow down long enough to truly feel. Let us go back to the 19th century, to the Great Wave. Between the 1840s and the early 1900s, something happened on the scale of human history that is almost impossible to wrap your mind around. Millions of people, entire villages, entire generations decided to leave. The Irish came first by the hundreds of thousands, fleeing a famine so devastating that in the span of just 5 years the island lost a quarter of its entire population. Think about that. 1 out of every 4 people gone, some to starvation, some to disease, and many, many more onto ships bound for the port of New York. Then came the Germans, escaping political revolutions that failed. Then southern Italians, where drought and poverty had made farming impossible for generations. Then Eastern European Jews, Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, fleeing brutal government-sponsored violence known as pogroms, where entire Jewish communities were attacked, their homes burned, their families torn apart. These were not people chasing adventure. These were people running for their lives, or running toward the only sliver of possibility they could imagine for their children. And the letters, oh, the letters made everything worse. Because here is the thing about letters from America. The people who made it and wanted to feel like they hadn't made a terrible mistake, they wrote home and made everything sound wonderful. Streets paved with gold was not just a metaphor people invented. People literally believed that. Relatives wrote home saying, "Come here, there is work, there is food, there is a future." What they left out, because who wants to write home and say, "I live in a room with no windows and I share a toilet with 40 strangers"? What they left out was the other half of the story. So people came and kept coming. Between 1800 and 1880, New York City's population doubled not once but every single decade. In 1820, the city held roughly 125,000 people. By 1870, it was approaching 1 million. By 1900, over 3 million. And the city, in all its chaos, in all its hunger for profit and speed, had to put all those people somewhere. The answer was the tenement. Now let me paint you a picture. You arrive at Ellis Island. You have been processed. You have stood in lines, had your eyes pried open by a doctor looking for disease, had your name, your beautiful, complicated ancestral name, possibly simplified or misspelled by a clerk who couldn't be bothered to get it right. You step off the ferry and onto the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and in 1880-1890 this one neighborhood was the most densely populated place on the face of the entire earth. Not in the city, not in the country, on Earth. Historians estimate that at its peak, parts of the Lower East Side held more than 300,000 people per square mile. To put that in perspective, today, Manhattan as a whole holds about 70,000 people per square mile. This was 4 times that density squeezed into just a few blocks in buildings that had no elevators, no central heating, no indoor plumbing, and no plan for any of it. A man who lived through it, named Abraham K. Hann, who would later become a celebrated writer and editor, described arriving in that neighborhood for the first time as stepping into a world that felt like the whole human race had been compressed into a single street. Every language at once, every smell at once, every sound at once. And standing on that street, tired and hopeful and slightly terrified, someone would tap you on the shoulder, often someone from your own country, speaking your own language, and say, "I know a building, I know a room, $10 a month, come, $10 a month." Which sounds reasonable until you realize that for $10 a month up to 7 people might share 3 rooms if you were lucky. Sometimes just 2 rooms, sometimes 1, and sometimes the room had no window at all. The buildings themselves tell the story of a city that moved too fast and cared too little. In the early 1800s, the Lower East Side had been a pleasant neighborhood. Wealthy Dutch and English families had built proper townhouses there, brick homes with gardens, with decent proportions, with shutters and chimneys, and all the quiet dignity of a comfortable life. But wealth moves. Wealth always moves. As the city grew northward, the affluent residents picked up and left, leaving behind their homes to landlords who saw something very different when they looked at those buildings. They did not see comfortable homes. They saw opportunity. They divided the rooms. Then they divided the divided rooms. They built additions in the backyard, sometimes in the dark of night, hastily, with cheap wood without permits or inspections. Where 2 families had lived, 10 moved in. Where a garden had grown, another building appeared, blocking all the light. By the time a family from County Cork or from Warsaw or from Naples came looking for a place to sleep, the building they entered bore almost no resemblance to what it had originally been. It had been carved up and stacked and extended and crammed full of humanity until it groaned under its own weight. And the landlords, they collected the rent every single week, not every month, because monthly rent created leverage for tenants, and they fixed nothing. Not the leaking ceilings, not the broken stairs, not the walls so thin that you could hear your neighbor breathe. They fixed nothing, because fixing things cost money, and the people living there had nowhere else to go. Here is the part that I find the most quietly devastating about this story. Most of the people who arrived and found themselves in these buildings, they weren't defeated by it. Not at first, maybe not ever. Because they had survived things that were worse. They had survived famine. They had survived persecution. They had survived weeks on a ship in the dark. A cramped room with leaking walls was not the worst thing they had ever endured, and there was something else. Something that no historian can fully quantify, but that you can feel if you read the diaries and the letters and the memoirs left behind by the people who lived through it. There was hope, not the naive Golden Streets kind of hope from the letters, the other kind, the worn-down, realistic, grinding daily kind of hope that says this is hard right now. But my children will know something different. That was the bargain they made, not with the landlord, not with the city, with the future. They crowded into those buildings 7 to a room, 10 to a room, because they believed they had to believe that this was not the destination. This was just the beginning, and the city that would become the greatest in the world was built brick by brick and garment by garment on the backs of people who slept on floors and cooked on coal stoves in rooms without windows, and still somehow found a reason to keep going. But what did that life actually look like once the door closed and the dream of America met the reality of 4 walls and a shared outhouse? That is exactly where we are headed next. Because the building itself, the actual structure, the actual design, the way it was built, and why is a story unto itself, a story about a contest that was supposed to solve the housing crisis, but made it so much worse. A story about an architect named James Ware, a magazine called The Plumber and Sanitary Engineer, and a building shape that became the most infamous symbol of urban failure in American history. The dumbbell tenement. Stay with me. So we left off with a promise, a building shape, a name so peculiar it sounds almost amusing until you understand what it actually meant for the people who had to live inside it. The dumbbell tenement. Let me take you there now. Picture a magazine office in Manhattan, 1878. A trade publication called The Plumber and Sanitary Engineer, which you have to admit is not exactly a title that screams excitement, decided to do something that sounds on the surface genuinely well-intentioned. They announced a design competition, open to any architect in the city. The challenge: design the best possible tenement building for a standard New York lot. A lot that measured exactly 25 feet wide and 100 feet long. The winner would receive a cash prize, and the design would be recommended as the new standard for tenement construction across the entire city. Hundreds of architects submitted entries, 200 proposals in total. And here is where I want you to pay attention, because this is one of those moments in history where well-meaning people made a decision that looks in hindsight almost breathtakingly naive. The judges, 5 of them distinguished men, serious men, looked at all 200 designs, and before they even announced a winner, they wrote something remarkable in their official report. They stated in plain language that the challenge itself was essentially impossible, that the physical and moral requirements for decent human housing simply could not be satisfied on a 25-foot lot. Read that again slowly. The judges of the competition looked at the problem and concluded this lot is too small to build decent housing on, and then they awarded the prize anyway. First place went to an architect named James Ware. His design was clever. It was genuinely clever in the way that a workaround is clever, not elegant, not ideal, but creative within very tight constraints. He pinched the building inward on both sides at the middle, just slightly, creating 2 narrow indentations, air shafts he called them, running from the ground up to the roof on each side of the building. From above, the footprint of the building looked like a dumbbell. Wide at the front, wide at the back, narrow in the middle where the shafts cut in. The idea was simple. The shafts would allow light and air to reach the interior rooms that had until now been completely sealed off from the outside world, and for about 5 minutes, metaphorically speaking, this seemed like a solution. Then reality arrived. The air shafts were about 2.5 feet wide. 2.5 feet. That is roughly the width of your shoulders, and they ran 60 feet straight down, enclosed on all 4 sides by brick walls. No sunlight reached the bottom. Almost no air moved through them. What they became almost immediately was something else entirely. They became garbage chutes. People on the upper floors, 4 stories up, 5 stories up, 6 stories up in buildings with no elevator, were not going to walk down several flights of narrow stairs to dispose of waste every single time. So they threw things out of the windows that opened onto the shaft. Potato peelings, broken crockery, ash from the coal stove. In the worst cases, far worse things than that. The shafts filled, they festered. In summer, the heat turned them into something that residents described as indescribable, a smell so deep and so thick it seeped through the walls. In winter, the shafts acted like flues drawing cold air and sometimes spreading fire from floor to floor with terrifying speed. Reformers of the era did not mince words. By the time the 1890s arrived, the dumbbell tenement had earned its own nickname in the housing literature of the day. They called it dark, damp, and disease-ridden, and those were the polite descriptions. A New York Times editorial from 1879, written the very year the design was adopted, had already warned that implementing this kind of building at scale would amplify, not reduce the evils of existing tenements. Nobody listened. By 1900, more than 80,000 of these buildings had been constructed in New York City. 80,000! And over 80% of the tenements on the Lower East Side followed this flawed model. Think about that the next time someone tells you that good intentions are enough. Now I want to pause here for just a moment because there is something I think deserves to be said that the history books tend to rush past. It would be easy, and frankly, it would be lazy to look at this story and assign blame neatly. The greedy landlords, the corrupt city officials, the naive architects, and yes, all of those people played their parts. But the machinery of the tenement was bigger than any one villain. Here is what I mean. The grid. The beautiful, rational, efficient, utterly merciless grid that defines Manhattan streets today was laid out in 1811 by a group of city planners called the Commissioners. They divided the entire island into rectangular blocks, and each block into standard lots 25 feet wide, 100 feet deep. This made sense for the New York of 1811, a city of roughly 100,000 people, and mostly single-family homes. What it created 50 years later when 1 million immigrants arrived looking for housing was a trap. Landlords had no choice but to build on those lots. That was the only land available. Architects had no choice but to design for those lots. That was the constraint. And so the entire tenement crisis, the overcrowding, the darkness, the disease was baked into the city's DNA before a single wave of immigrants had even arrived. The grid didn't cause the suffering with malice, it caused it with indifference, and that, if you think about it, might be worse. Let us talk about the landlords for a moment, because this is a part of the story that gets complicated in ways I find genuinely fascinating. You might imagine the typical tenement landlord as a top-hatted villain, rubbing his hands together and cackling as he counted his weekly rents, and some of them were more or less exactly that. By 1880, more than 60% of Lower East Side properties were owned by what historians call absentee landlords, people who lived far away from the buildings they owned, people who had never once walked up those narrow stairwells, never once breathed that air, never once seen the leaking ceiling that had been leaking for 3 years and that they had been repeatedly asked to fix. They collected the rent and they disappeared. Because the rent came in every week, not every month. I want to be clear about that. Weekly collection was standard, not because it was more convenient, but because a family who owed a month's rent had some leverage. A family who owed a week's rent could be put out on the street by Sunday. A 3-room apartment on the first floor of a tenement near the end of the 19th century rented for somewhere between $12 and $13 a month. On the 4th floor, slightly less, maybe $9.50 or $10. Lower floors meant louder noise, but closer to the street, and in those buildings being closer to the street was somehow considered preferable. Rent took up roughly 1/3 of a family's total wages. which meant that paying rent required the wages of multiple people. Not just the father, not just the husband, everyone. We will get to what that meant for the children soon. But first, back to the landlords. Here is the thing I find almost darkly funny about the tenement landlord story. A significant number of the worst landlords on the Lower East Side were themselves immigrants. Irish landlords who had arrived a generation earlier, worked their way up, scraped together enough to buy a building, and then turned around and charged their newly arrived countrymen the highest rents they could get away with. There is something in that dynamic that is deeply human and deeply uncomfortable. The person most willing to exploit you is sometimes the person who most recently was you. Not always, but often enough that housing reformers of the era noted it specifically. And what about the building itself? Let me walk you through a typical dumbbell tenement room by room. You enter from the street through a narrow hallway. The hallway is dark. There is usually one gas lamp somewhere, or no lamp at all before gas was installed, which for many buildings was quite late in the century. The smell hits you almost immediately. Coal smoke, boiled cabbage, something unidentifiable from the shaft on your right. The staircase is directly ahead. Each floor holds 4 apartments, 2 in the front of the building, 2 in the back. Each apartment has between 3 and 4 rooms arranged in a line. Historians call this a railroad layout. One room leads into the next, like cars on a train. No corridor, no privacy. To reach the back bedroom, you walk through the front room, through the middle room, through whatever is happening in each of those spaces. The front room, the parlour, if the family was trying to maintain any dignity at all, measured about 10.5 by 11.25 feet. That is smaller than most walk-in closets in a modern American home. The bedroom in the back averaged about 7 by 8.5 feet. 7 by 8.5. That is the size of a large bathroom, sometimes smaller. And in that bedroom, depending on how many boarders the family was taking in to help cover the rent, you might find 5, 6, 7 people sleeping. Adults sometimes slept in shifts, one person rising for the night shift, while another came home and took their place on the same mattress. I have read accounts from this period that describe the smell of a tenement bedroom at night as something close to physical, a wall of warm, still air saturated with breath and sweat and coal dust that hit you the moment you opened the door. Children often slept 4 or 5 to a bed, or on the floor, and this happened across the chairs pushed together. Now I want to ask you something because I genuinely wonder about this when I read the history. If you were a parent living in those conditions, 4 rooms, 7 people, 1 window, that faced a 2.5-foot shaft of rotting garbage, what would you hold on to? What would keep you from despair? The answer for most of these families seems to have been 2 things: community, and the very specific, very stubborn conviction that this was temporary. The tenement buildings of the Lower East Side were not silent places. They were loud. Extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly loud by the standards of modern apartment living. Every wall was thin. Every floor was thin. You heard your neighbours' arguments, their prayers, their lullabies, their grief. And somehow that proximity became its own kind of warmth. People watched each other's children. They passed food through windows. When someone got sick, the women on the floor organised. When someone died, the community mourned together in ways that spilled out into the stairwell and onto the street. There was a word used by Eastern European Jewish immigrants for the mutual aid networks that formed in these buildings: Landsmannschaften. Organizations of people from the same town or region back home pooled together in a new country to help one another survive. If you lost your job, the Landsmannschaften helped cover your rent. If you got sick, someone came. If you needed a reference for a new job, someone spoke for you. The tenement didn't just house misery. It housed alongside the misery one of the most remarkable experiments in human solidarity that the 19th century ever produced. That does not make it acceptable. The conditions were genuinely terrible, and the people who built and maintained those buildings knew they were terrible and profited from them anyway. But I think it matters. It matters a great deal to hold both things at once. The building was a failure. The people inside it were not. By 1901, the city finally passed the Tenement House Act that outlawed the dumbbell design entirely. 82 years after the grid was drawn, 34 years after the first feeble attempt at regulation in 1867, and 22 years after the dumbbell shape was officially adopted as the standard. The new law mandated indoor toilets, running water, a window in every room that opened to actual outside air, not a 2.5-foot shaft, larger courtyards, better fire protection. It was on paper a genuine improvement, and it came too late for the 2 million people who had already spent years, in some cases entire adult lives, inside those buildings. But here is the quiet irony that keeps me thinking about this story. Many of those 82,000 old law buildings still stand today, right now. If you walk certain blocks of the Lower East Side, you're walking past the actual walls, the actual brick, the actual narrow windows. The buildings outlasted the people who built them. The buildings outlasted the system that created them, and in some strange way they outlasted the shame. Because today those same streets, once the most crowded, most desperate, most neglected in the entire world, are among the most photographed in New York City. People take tours. They walk those blocks with their coffee cups and their smartphones, looking up at the facades with that particular expression tourists get when they are trying to feel history. And standing on those sidewalks, it is almost impossible to imagine. But try. Because the next time you're settling in for the night, your own bed, your own pillow, your own air, there is something worth sitting with for just a moment. Every convenience you take for granted has a story behind it. Every housing regulation, every fire escape, every window that opens onto actual sky. Someone lived in a building that had none of those things, and someone else fought loudly and persistently, and at great personal cost to make sure future generations wouldn't have to. We owe both of them something. We have talked about the building, its shape, its walls, its breathless logic of profit over people. But what happened inside those walls once the door closed and the city kept going without you? What did it actually feel like to wake up in a tenement morning? No running water, no working fire escape the shaft outside your window, already starting its daily rot in the heat. What did it smell like? What did it sound like? What did you eat for breakfast when the pushcart wasn't out yet, and you had exactly 2 pennies in your pocket and 4 children looking at you? That is exactly where we are headed next, into the rooms themselves. 325 square feet, 7 people, and a mathematics of survival that most of us can barely begin to calculate. 325 square feet. Stop for a second and think about what that means in real terms. Look around wherever you're sitting right now. Count the space you're in. Your bedroom, your living room, the couch. You're stretched out on the little corner where someone left their shoes by the door. 325 square feet is smaller than most American studio apartments today. It is roughly the size of half a subway car, and into that space, that single, indivisible, unforgiving rectangle of floor, a family of 10 people was expected to fit. Not just sleep. Fit. As in live, cook, eat, argue, grieve, celebrate a birthday, nurse a sick child through the night, take in a boarder for extra rent money, and somehow maintain the internal conviction that you are a human being with dignity. This is what I want to sit with tonight. Not the building's architecture, we already walked through that, but the mathematics of the space itself, the daily arithmetic of too many people and not enough room, and what that does to a person over time. The first thing you need to understand about a tenement apartment is that it had no hallway. That sounds like a small thing. It is not. A hallway in a home, even a short one, even a narrow one, is more than just a passage between rooms. It is a transition space. It gives you a moment between the outside world and the inside world, a beat of privacy before you enter. In a tenement apartment there was no such beat. The front door opened directly into the kitchen, which was also depending on the size of the family and how creatively they used their space. The dining room, the workshop, the place where the mother cooked while the father slept on a cot 3 feet away, and where the boarder ate his breakfast while the children tried not to stare. The kitchen was the heart of the apartment and its most chaotic room. A coal-burning stove sat in the centre of it all. In winter, that stove was a miracle, the single source of heat for the entire apartment, occasionally for an entire floor of the building, if people left their doors open to share the warmth. In summer, it was something close to punishment. July and August, in a tenement kitchen with a coal stove burning laundry boiling in a pot on top of it, the shaft outside the window not moving an ounce of air, was a level of heat that people who lived through it described as almost physical in its oppressiveness. There is a reason so many tenement residents slept on their fire escapes in summer, not because it was comfortable, because the inside of the apartment was genuinely harder to breathe in. Behind the kitchen was the front room. Some families called it the parlour, a word that carried so much aspirational weight it is almost heartbreaking to type it. A parlour, as if they were living in a proper house with a proper social life and visitors who came on Sunday afternoons. And actually, and this is the part that moves me, some of them genuinely tried. There are accounts from this period of immigrant families who kept their front room as tidy as humanly possible despite everything. A small table with a cloth on it, a photograph hung on the wall, a piece of embroidery that had come over from the old country tucked into a frame, not because anyone from the outside world was likely to visit and admire it, but because it reminded them of who they were, because in a world that relentlessly told them they were poor and unwanted and temporary, a cloth on a table was a quiet act of resistance. I find that genuinely beautiful. Beyond the front room was the bedroom, the back bedroom usually about 7 feet by 8.5 feet. No window to the outside. If the building had air shafts, the kind we discussed, the bedroom window opened onto that 2.5-foot gap of fetid air. If it was an older building, the bedroom had no window at all. None. Just 4 walls, a low ceiling, and whatever number of people needed to sleep in it that night. Now here is where the story gets into territory that the history books usually handle very clinically, but that I think deserves a slower, more honest look. The border. By 1850, census records show that roughly 35% of households in major American cities housed at least one person who was not a family member, a lodger, a roomer, a boarder, someone who paid a few dollars a week, sometimes less, to sleep in whatever space could be made available. Sometimes that was the kitchen floor, sometimes a corner of the back bedroom partitioned off by a hanging curtain. Sometimes a cot wedged between the children's sleeping area and the wall. Reports from housing inspectors of the era describe what they called the hotbed system. A single bed, sometimes 2, rented out in shifts. One man working the day shift at the factory came home, slept for a few hours, then left. Another man working the night shift came in, took the same bed still warm, and slept through the day. The bed was never cold. It was never fully anyone's. And before you judge, before any of us judges, it is worth sitting with the economics of why this happened. Rent was typically about 1/3 of a family's total combined income. For a family bringing in perhaps $8 or $10 a week, across multiple working members, $12 a month in rent was not sustainable without help. A boarder who paid $2 or $3 a week covered a significant portion of that gap. It was not a choice made in comfort. It was a calculation made in desperation. And it was a calculation that nearly every family on the Lower East Side made at some point. A study from 1908 found that 1 in every 4 immigrant families had at least one boarder living with them. 1 in 4. That means the overcrowding we think we understand 7 people in 3 rooms was in many cases not the whole picture. It was 7 people plus 1 or 2 more. You might be wondering at this point, and I genuinely wonder this myself when I sit with this history, what did privacy mean in a space like that? Did it exist at all? The honest answer is it existed, but in forms we would barely recognize. Privacy in the tenement was not spatial. It couldn't be. There was no room literally for spatial privacy. Instead, it was a kind of collective agreement, an unspoken social contract that everyone in the apartment, family members and boarders alike, implicitly maintained. You looked away at certain moments. You pretended not to hear certain conversations. You gave people a few minutes alone in the kitchen before you came in for your breakfast. For Italian immigrant families in particular, this was a profound cultural shock. Historians who have studied the Italian immigrant experience note something that I find quietly fascinating. Back in the villages of southern Italy, where many of these families had come from, people lived in small houses too. But they spent most of their waking hours outside, working in fields, sitting in front of their houses, socializing in the piazza. The indoors was for sleeping and not much else. In New York, they found themselves confined indoors in a way their culture had never prepared them for. The same small space for eating, sleeping, working, nursing the sick, grieving the dead. The outside world, the street, the stairwell, the fire escape became their piazza, a makeshift public square where the social life of the building played out. We will spend more time on that street life soon, but for now, stay with me inside these walls a little longer. There is one more dimension to this story that I want to raise because I think it is the most quietly complicated part of all. What happened to the concept of family, the internal life of a family, when everyone lived this close together all the time with no separation at all between the hours of rest and the hours of work and the hours of simple human tension? A marriage conducted entirely in one room. A parent trying to discipline a child with an audience of boarders. A teenager with nowhere to go to be alone with their thoughts. A person grieving in a space where grief had to be compressed because there was a shift starting in 2 hours and breakfast to be made, and the boarder was still asleep on his cot. Housing reformers of the late 19th century were deeply preoccupied with what they called the moral effects of overcrowding. Some of their concerns were frankly prejudiced middle-class reformers projecting their own anxieties about immigrant communities onto the data they were collecting. But some of their observations were simply accurate. When you have no space to be alone, you have no space to process. When you have no space to process, things accumulate. The pressure does not disappear, it compresses, and it finds an outlet somewhere. For many tenement families, that outlet was the street. For others, it was religion, the synagogue, the church, the parish hall, where for a few hours a week you could sit in a room that was not your own and feel something larger than the ceiling 6 feet above your head. For others still, it was something darker. But what strikes me most when I read through the diaries and letters and oral histories left behind by people who actually lived this life is not the darkness. It is the laughter. There are accounts, real ones, documented ones, of people laughing in those apartments, playing cards on the kitchen table on a Saturday night with the boarder and the neighbour from upstairs, singing sometimes, children making up games in the 3 feet of clear floor space near the stove. Human beings are, I think, extraordinarily adaptable. Not because hardship is good for us, it isn't, but because we will find something worth holding on to almost anywhere, even in 325 square feet, even on a hotbed still warm from someone else, even in a room with no window and no sky. And yet, there is a moment in this story, a specific documented, quantifiable moment, when the mathematics of overcrowding stopped being just a quality of life issue and became something more urgent, something measurable in bodies. In 1894, the New York State Assembly Tenement House Committee surveyed 8,000 buildings on the Lower East Side. They found 255,000 people living in them, and they calculated that the average population density in those blocks was 800 residents per acre. 800 people per acre. At the time, that was higher than any recorded density in Bombay, higher than the most crowded neighborhoods of Calcutta. New York City's Lower East Side was by the numbers the most densely occupied patch of Earth on the entire planet. And in that density, in those tight rooms, those shared beds, those curtained-off corners where a family tried to maintain some kind of ordinary life, something was quietly and visibly lethally at work. Something that had no smell, no sound, that you couldn't see on the wall or taste in the food or hear in the stairwell at night, but that moved through those apartments with absolute efficiency. What happened when disease arrived in a building where 10 people shared 3 rooms and 20 families shared a single backyard privy, that is a story that unfolds in the next chapter of this night. And I want you to be prepared, because the numbers are going to break your heart a little. Water. Of everything that separates daily life in those tenements from anything most of us have ever experienced, water is the thing I keep coming back to. Not disease, not the darkness, not even the noise. Water, the simple, unremarkable act of turning on a tap and having clean water come out, is something so woven into the fabric of your life right now that you probably haven't consciously thought about it in years. You brush your teeth, you make coffee, you wash your hands after touching the subway pole or your phone or the cat or whatever it is. The water just comes, it's just there. In a tenement in 1880 or 1890 or even 1900, that tap did not exist. In the earliest buildings, before any pipes reached the interior of the structure at all, there was one source of water for the entire building, a single spigot, set into the wall of the backyard, ground level. If you lived on the 5th floor, and plenty of people did here, is what your morning looked like. You woke in the dark before sunrise because you needed water, before you could cook breakfast, and you needed to cook breakfast before your husband left for work, and your husband left for work before 6 in the morning. You took a bucket, you carried it down 4 flights of narrow stairs. You filled it at the spigot in the backyard, which in winter was frozen half the time and required actual physical effort just to turn. You carried it back up, 4 flights. A full bucket of water weighs roughly 40 pounds, and that was just for breakfast. Now think about laundry. A family of 8 or 10 people generating laundry every single week in a world with no washing machines, no laundromats, nothing. Just a large pot on the coal stove boiling water which had to be carried up from the yard and hours of manual scrubbing and wringing. Women of the tenements, according to accounts from the period, regularly carried water up multiple flights of stairs several times a day. Not once, several times. Their arms, their shoulders, their backs, the physical toll of that labour was cumulative, invisible to anyone outside the building, and completely unremarked upon by the city that housed them. There is something about that image, a woman on the 4th floor of a tenement in the January cold, hauling 40 pounds of water up a staircase that smelled of garbage and coal smoke, that I find more quietly devastating than almost anything else in this entire story. Not because it is dramatic, because it isn't. It was just a Tuesday. Let me ask you something, though. Have you ever gone camping or stayed somewhere without running water, even for a weekend? Do you remember the small, persistent inconvenience of it? The way you had to think about water before you did anything, plan around it, ration it, now multiply that by every single day, for years. In a building with 12 families, none of whom have any more water than you do, all of whom are queuing in the same backyard in all weather before the sun comes up. That is the baseline, And remember, this was New York City, not a remote rural settlement, not a frontier outpost. The greatest city in the Western world at the time, a city where by the 1860s wealthy residents had already installed flush toilets and running water in their private homes. The Croton Aqueduct, a genuine marvel of engineering that brought fresh water from upstate New York all the way into the city, had been flowing since 1842. It delivered clean water to the mansions of the Upper East Side, to the hotels, to the restaurants where the city's elite dined, and it flowed in pipes just beneath the streets of the Lower East Side, almost close enough to touch. But it did not go up into the tenements. Not until the building owners were compelled by law to make it happen, which, depending on the building, could be decades away. This is one of those facts in history that I think reveals something true about how cities actually work then, and sometimes now. The infrastructure of comfort follows money. It does not precede poverty. It arrives eventually when enough people with enough power decide that the absence of it has become inconvenient for them. Now, light. In a typical old law tenement of the 1880s, out of the 18 rooms on a single floor, only 2 received direct sunlight. 2. The other 16 existed in a kind of permanent grey half-darkness. Not complete blackness, there was always some ambient light filtering in from somewhere. But the quality of light in those interior rooms has been described by people who saw them as something closer to dusk than today. Even at noon, on a clear summer afternoon, the back bedroom of a tenement apartment could feel like late evening. There were no electric lights yet in most of these buildings. Gas lamps existed in some, a thin yellowish glow that burned imperfectly and consumed oxygen from air that was already short of it. Candles burned for those who could afford them, which was not always everyone. For a woman doing piecework at home, stitching garments, assembling artificial flowers, finishing hems, the eye strain was chronic. There are accounts from this period of immigrant women in their 30s, with vision already significantly deteriorated from years of fine needlework in inadequate light. Think about that for a moment. These were young women in the prime of their lives in a country they had travelled thousands of miles to reach, who were slowly going partially blind, not because of disease, not because of any dramatic tragedy, but simply because they lived in rooms where the sun could not reach. And then there is the smell. I want to be careful here because it is easy to write about the smell of poverty in a way that is reductive, that makes the people who lived in it seem diminished. They weren't. The smell was the product of a system, not of the people. But the smell was real, and it was one of the most commented upon features of tenement life by everyone who encountered it: residents, visitors, reformers, journalists, health officials. Coal smoke was the dominant note. Every apartment had a coal stove burning for most of the day, for cooking, for heating, for boiling laundry. The smoke blackened the walls. It settled into clothing, into hair, into the upholstery of the few pieces of furniture people owned. Housing inspectors of the era noted that even in summer months after the stoves were turned down to their lowest settings, the smell of old coal smoke was embedded in the wood of the floors and walls, as though it were part of the building's own structure. Layered over the coal smoke was cooking, and this is the part that is more complex because cooking smells are not necessarily bad. A kitchen fragrant with onions and garlic and whatever protein a family could afford is not an unpleasant thing in isolation. But when you have 12 apartments on 4 floors, all with their stoves burning at the same time, all cooking in spaces with no real ventilation, all sharing a stairwell that was essentially a chimney, the accumulated smell was something different, rich, dense, almost textured. A visitor to the Lower East Side in the 1890s described the smell of a tenement stairwell in summer as something you had to push through rather than simply walk through. And then there was the outhouse. The 1867 law required 1 outhouse for every 20 residents. In a building with 22 apartments and an average of 7 people each, that's potentially over 150 people sharing 7 or 8 outdoor privies in the backyard. 7 or 8. And crucially, the law required them. Nobody was required to keep them clean. Nobody inspected them. Nobody emptied them on any schedule. They were simply there. In summer, the heat made them close to unbearable. Residents on upper floors faced with the choice between descending 4 flights of stairs in the dark to reach the outhouse, or using a chamber pot that they would empty in the morning made the practical choice. Chamber pots were used, and in some documented cases documented by housing inspectors who arrived in the morning and found evidence those chamber pots were emptied out of windows rather than carried down the stairs, which fed back into the problem of the air shafts we talked about earlier, which is to say that all of these systems were connected. The lack of plumbing fed the outhouse problem. The outhouse problem fed the smell. The smell encouraged people to keep windows closed. Closed windows reduced what little ventilation existed, and reduced ventilation made the interior air already thick with coal smoke and cooking and the breath of 10 people into something that moved through the building like a weight. Here's what I find remarkable, though. If you read the accounts of people who actually lived in these buildings, not the housing reformers who visited them, not the journalists who wrote about them from the outside, but the people themselves, the smell is not what they emphasize. What they emphasize almost universally is the sound of the building at night. A baby crying 2 floors up, someone's husband coming home from the night shift, footsteps on the stairs, the door creaking. The couple on the 3rd floor having an argument in a language you didn't speak, but whose emotional content was unmistakable. The man in the front room, the boarder, turning over on his cot. A dog somewhere. A cart on the street below. The building settling, the wooden floors shifting slightly under the weight of all those lives. One account I've read from a memoir written decades later by a woman who grew up on the Lower East Side in the 1890s describes the sound of a tenement at 3 in the morning as something that was oddly comforting. Not in a sentimental way, not in the way that soft music or a familiar voice might comfort you, but in the raw practical way that reminds you that you are not alone, that all around you in all directions through every thin wall and every creaking floor other people are also awake, also worrying, also trying. There is a word in Yiddish used often in these communities that captures this feeling with a precision that English rarely achieves. Zimisht, a kind of beautiful chaos. A tangle of people and things and noise and life all pressed together beyond the point of any real organization, but somehow producing something that works. The tenement at its most human was exactly that. Zimisht, not clean, not quiet, not comfortable, but alive in every inch of its cramped, smoky, water-hauled, underlit existence. Now, something I want you to sit with before we move on. We have been talking about the physical conditions of this world, the water, the light, the smell, the sound. All of this was the sensory texture of daily existence for people who were simultaneously building the foundations of modern American urban life. The garment industry that clothed the country, the labor movements that would eventually give American workers the weekend. The pushcart economy that would evolve into some of the most important commercial corridors in New York. All of that was happening in buildings that did not have running water. I find that almost impossible to hold in my mind. And yet, there it is. The people who built the city's future were the ones hauling buckets of water up the stairs. And in the next part of this night, we're going to look at exactly what that work looked like up close. Because the tenement was not only a place where people lived. For many families, it was also a factory where the workers were the family members, where the machines never stopped, and where the youngest hands in the room were often the most indispensable. Somewhere in the middle of this story there is a moment that I keep returning to. It is not a dramatic moment. There is no crowd, no speech, no turning point in history. It is just a man at a sewing machine. His name was Harris Levine. He had come from the Russian Empire with his wife Jenny sometime around 1890. They had 5 children. They lived at 97 Orchard Street on the Lower East Side, a building that still stands today, now a museum, which is one of those facts about New York that I find quietly extraordinary. Harris was a dressmaker, and like hundreds, perhaps thousands of men in his position, he did not go to work. Work came to him. Because the front room of the apartment, the 325 square feet that the Levine family called home, was not just a home. It was also starting almost immediately after they arrived a factory. Harris converted the parlour into a garment workshop. He set up a treadle sewing machine near the window, the one window that faced the street, the one that let in the most light, the precious daylight you needed to see what you were stitching. He hired 3 additional workers, and from that point on the Levine apartment operated as both a family residence and a small commercial enterprise simultaneously every single day but Saturday. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, in 3 rooms. With 5 children, a wife, 3 hired workers, and whatever ambient chaos a tenement building on the Lower East Side generates by simply existing. I want you to think about what this actually looks like. You're standing in the front room of the Levine apartment on a Tuesday morning in 1893. The sewing machine is going. Harris is at it, his foot working the treadle, in a steady rhythm, his hands guiding fabric. One of the hired workers, a young man from somewhere in Eastern Europe, probably sleeping on a cot in the corner, is pressing a seam with a heavy iron heated on the coal stove. Another worker is at a second machine or basting pieces together by hand if there is no second machine. The third may be cutting. And somewhere in this same room, in the space not occupied by machinery and workers and fabric, Jenny is cooking breakfast. Because the children need to eat before school, and someone needs to have already carried water up from the yard. And the coal stove that is heating the pressing iron is also the stove she's cooking on. And at some point, maybe while the ironing is happening and the sewing machines are running and breakfast is being made, one of the children wakes up and walks through the front room through the factory to get to the kitchen. Because that is the only way. There is no other way. This is the tenement as factory. And it is one of the most common, most widespread and least discussed features of 19th century working class life in New York. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. When you think about the word sweatshop, what do you picture? Most of us, I think, picture a large building, rows of machines, hundreds of workers under a single roof, overseers walking the floor. The image we have is industrial external separate from home life. But in the 1880s and 90s, the original sweatshop was nothing like that. The sweating system, and that is what it was actually called at the time, was built on subcontracting. A large manufacturer would cut fabric and send the cut pieces out to a middleman, often called a sweater. The sweater would then distribute those pieces to families working in their tenement apartments, who would sew them together, press them, finish them, and return the completed garments. The families were paid per piece, not per hour, not per day, per piece, which meant that your income was determined entirely by how fast you could work and how many pieces you could complete. There was no floor, no guaranteed wage. If you were sick, you earned nothing. If your child was sick and you had to stop working to care for them, you earned nothing. If the fabric was difficult or the design was complicated and took longer than usual, you earned less per hour. And the sweater, the middleman, had every incentive in the world to reduce the price per piece over time. To squeeze, which is precisely where the word comes from. You were being sweated, wrung out economically, slowly, steadily, for as much as the system could extract from you. A seamstress working at piecework in the 1860s could earn somewhere between 20 and 25 cents a day. That is not a typo. 20 to 25 cents, working 16 hours. By the 1880s, wages had improved somewhat for some categories of work, but the structural logic remained identical. You worked as fast as your body allowed. The person above you in the chain paid you as little as they could get away with, and there was always someone newer, more desperate, more willing to accept less waiting just behind you. The garment trade in late 19th century New York was enormous. By 1909, New York City produced 70% of all women's clothing and 40% of all men's clothing in the entire country. The clothes that American families wore, the shirtwaists, the coats, the dresses, were in an enormous proportion made in tenement apartments and small workshops on the Lower East Side. Think about that the next time you look at a piece of clothing and wonder where it came from. The supply chain has changed its geography over the past century, but the logic-cutting labour costs to the minimum the market will bear. Distributing that labour into spaces invisible to the consumer, building the price differential into the product, while the person who made it lives in a room with no windows, that logic is older than the zipper. I'm not saying that to be grim. I'm saying it because I think it matters to understand that what these families experienced was not an accident of history. It was a system, a deliberately constructed system that functioned exactly as designed, producing enormous wealth for people at the top of it and extracting nearly everything from the people at the bottom. Now let me give you a specific picture of what piecework actually felt like, because the numbers alone do not quite capture it. Imagine you are finishing the hems on ladies' garments. Each hem is a specific number of inches. You are paid, let us say, 3 cents. Per finished hem in the late 1880s, a fast experienced worker can finish perhaps 10 or 12 hems in an hour. That is 30 to 36 cents per hour, which sounds almost reasonable until you remember that you're paying for your own thread, your own needles, your own lamp oil to work by at night, and that the sweater can and routinely does reject finished pieces for quality reasons, real or invented, and pay nothing for the work done, and that the work is seasonal. There are months when orders flood in, and months when there is almost nothing at all. Women who did this work in their tenement apartments, and it was primarily women because the men who could find factory work usually took it, described the experience of piecework as something that colonized your consciousness. You counted constantly. You counted pieces the way other people count money. You woke up in the morning already calculating 6 hems before breakfast if I start at 5, 10 before the children need to leave for school. If I work until midnight, that is $45.50, 50 times 3 cents, $1.50, against a rent of $12 a month, against food, against coal. The math was always present. The math was never quite enough, and yet you kept counting, because counting was how you survived. There is one more dimension of the tenement as factory that I want to spend time on, because it connects to something that will matter later in this story. The work was not limited to garments. In apartments across the Lower East Side, families made artificial flowers for ladies' hats, painstakingly constructed silk and paper blooms that were glued together petal by petal, often by the light of a single lamp, often with children as young as 5 or 6 helping to attach the smallest pieces. They made cigars, they finished brushes, they assembled the tiny component parts of manufactured goods that required fine motor skills and patience but not specialized training. All of this work entered the supply chains of legitimate American businesses. All of it ended up in shops and department stores that middle-class American consumers patronized without any particular knowledge of where the products had been made or under what conditions. A lady buying artificial flowers for her Sunday hat from a department store on Fifth Avenue had no way to know, and probably no mechanism to find out that those flowers had been assembled at 2 in the morning in a 3-room apartment by a woman with failing eyesight and 3 children asleep in the back room. The invisibility was structural. It was not the result of dishonesty on any particular person's part. It was the result of a system that had no interest in making itself visible. Jacob Riis, whose name we will return to at greater length later in this story, was one of the first people to crack that invisibility. To walk into those apartments with a camera, to point the lens at what was actually there. But that comes later. For now I want to come back to Harris Levine, because here is what happened to him. He worked in that apartment in that 3-room factory home for 13 years. 13 years of 10-hour days, 6 days a week with workers and children and his wife, all sharing that same small space. And then in 1905 he moved the family to Brooklyn. He opened a new shop this time outside the apartment. A real shop. A dedicated space for the work, separate from the home. And his grandchildren, people who are alive today, or were recently, grew up in a completely different world from the one he had inhabited. People who went to school without stopping to sew hems first. People who lived in apartments that were just apartments. People who had no particular reason to think about where the clothes on their backs had come from, or who had made them, or in what light. This is the trajectory of the tenement story. Not a straight line from misery to prosperity. Not a simple American dream narrative where hard work equals reward. But something more complicated, more real, more earned. One generation's sacrifice compressed into 13 years of a sewing machine at a window. The next generation's freedom purchased with exactly that price. Now I have been talking about the adults in these stories. The men and women who carried the weight of survival consciously, who understood the bargain they had made and chose to make it anyway. But there is a whole other population inside these tenements that we have not yet properly looked at. The children. And what happened to the children in these buildings, what was asked of them, what was taken from them, and what some of them managed to become anyway, is a story that deserves its own full telling. So that is exactly where we are going right now. Because the question of what it meant to be a child in a 19th century tenement is not simply a question about poverty. It is a question about something that a society reveals about itself when it decides or fails to decide what it owes to its youngest and most vulnerable people. And the answer that New York gave in the 1880s and 90s is one that I think will stay with you for a while. Let me tell you about a child named Antonia. She was Italian. She lived on the Lower East Side sometime in the 1880s, and she was sick. Not so sick that she couldn't work, because in the tenement economy of that era, being sick enough to die was sometimes the only illness that excused you from the sewing machine, but sick enough that she couldn't go to school. Jacob Riis wrote about her. He described her as a small girl who had taken her place among the wage earners, even while her illness persisted. She stitched garments at a machine that her family had acquired on installment payments, the kind of arrangement where you never quite finish paying, and the machine never quite belongs to you. She worked in the apartment that was also a factory, and she did it because there was no alternative. Not because her parents didn't love her, not because they were cruel, but because the rent was $12 a month and the machine was paid for by the piece. And the pieces added up to survival, and survival required all available hands, including the small ones, including the sick ones. This is the story of children in the 19th century tenement, and I want to tell it as honestly as I can. Let's start with the numbers because they are genuinely staggering. By 1870, the census found that roughly 1 out of every 8 children in the United States was employed. 1 in 8. By 1900, that figure had risen to more than 1 in 5. Between the ages of 10 and 15, and those are the ages the census tracked, no fewer than 18% of all children in America were in some form of paid labor. And that figure did not count the children doing homework in tenement apartments, because homework was technically a family arrangement, not formal employment, and the census had no real mechanism to capture it. which means the actual number was higher, possibly much higher. A kindergarten teacher in New York City in 1903 visited the home of an Italian brother and sister, aged 4 and 5 after they stopped attending school. She found them at home wrapping coloured paper around pieces of wire, making the stems of artificial flowers. Their older sisters were making the leaves and petals. The mother was assembling the flowers. The father was probably working somewhere else doing something else. 4 years old, 5 years old. Their small fingers bending wire all day so that well-dressed women in Manhattan could wear flowers on their hats. When the teacher asked why they weren't in school, the mother said they couldn't be spared. When concerned adults brought this to the attention of a school attendance official, they were told something remarkable. Under the law as it stood in 1903, children were technically exempt from mandatory school attendance until their 7th birthday. 4 years old was not covered. The law had not imagined 4 years old would need to be covered. I want to pause here and say something that I think matters. When we tell this story in a certain way, a way that emphasizes the helplessness of these families, the victimhood of the children, the cruelty of a system, we sometimes inadvertently strip the people involved of something important, their complexity. Because here is the truth that I find running underneath all of this history like a current you can only feel if you slow down. The parents of these children were not indifferent to their suffering. In almost every account I've read from this period, social worker reports, newspaper interviews, oral histories recorded decades later, the immigrant parents of the Lower East Side were ferociously, almost desperately invested in their children's futures. They wanted school for their children. They believed in school the way some people believe in a kind of secular religion. Education was the word you heard over and over in the memoirs and letters of immigrant families from this period. It was the thing that justified the sacrifice. But the gap between what they wanted and what they could afford, that gap was enormous, and it was filled with wire stems and garment seams and small hands that should have been holding a pencil. One school principal in a Lower East Side public school in the 1890s estimated that roughly a third of his students came to class visibly fatigued because they had been working before school or had worked late the night before, or both, not occasionally, regularly, as a matter of course. The teacher knew, the principal knew, and they did what they could, which was mostly to keep the doors open and hope the children kept coming. Now let me tell you about the children who weren't in apartments at all. In the 1850s, New York City was estimated to have between 5,000 and 10,000 vagrant children living on its streets. Some were orphans, some had been abandoned, some had simply drifted away from families that were too overwhelmed to hold on to them. And some, a category that breaks my heart every time I read about it, were children who had been sent out by their families to earn money on the street and had never quite found their way back. These were the newsboys. The newsie is one of those figures from American history that has been romantically softened by time. The plucky kid with a stack of papers under his arm shouting headlines on a street corner, quick with a wisecrack destined for greatness. Horatio Alger wrote stories about them. Broadway made a musical about them. The mythology is endearing. The reality was considerably less musical. A newsboy in 1880 was typically between 8 and 14 years old. He bought his papers from the distribution office at wholesale, usually at half a cent each, and sold them for 1 cent. On a good day, if he positioned himself at a busy corner and worked from morning until the evening editions came out, he might clear 40 or 50 cents. From that 40 or 50 cents he had to eat. He had to sleep somewhere. A bed in one of the charitable lodging houses run by the Children's Aid Society cost 5 cents a night. 5 cents for a bed, another few cents for a meal. That was the entire margin. On bad days, rainy days, slow news days when another boy had already claimed the best corner, there was no margin at all, and the lodging house required that you have the 5 cents. If you didn't, you slept under a staircase, or on a grate in the sidewalk where warm air came up from a basement. Jacob Riis photographed them there. Boys in groups of 2 and 3 pressed together for warmth on iron grates in the sidewalk covered by whatever they could find. He titled one of those photographs Street Arabs, which is a term we would not use today and which even then was charged with condescension. But what the photograph shows, what it cannot help but show regardless of what you call it, is children, small children, sleeping outside in a city that contained more wealth per square mile than almost anywhere else on earth. Here is something I want to offer as a counterpoint to the darkness of all this, because I think the story would be incomplete without it. The children of the tenement were also simultaneously stubbornly, sometimes gloriously just children. They played in whatever space was available to them, which was usually the street. Hester Street in the 1890s was a kind of outdoor living room for the children of the Lower East Side. On summer evenings, after the pushcarts had been dragged away and the heat had eased slightly, the street filled with children playing games that had been brought from a dozen different countries and were now merging into something distinctly American. They made up games in the space between the delivery wagons. They collected pieces of things, bottle caps, bits of wire, odd scraps of fabric, and turned them into toys, because manufactured toys were not something most of these families could afford. They ran, they argued, they formed the kinds of alliances and rivalries that children form everywhere in every century, regardless of circumstances. A visiting nurse named Lillian Wald, whose work we'll talk about later, wrote about sitting on her stoop on Henry Street in the 1890s and watching the children of the neighbourhood play. She described them as simultaneously the most resilient and the most vulnerable population she had ever encountered. Capable of extraordinary adaptability, she wrote, capable of joy in circumstances that seemed to permit none. And I think that is true. I think it is genuinely, historically, documentably true. The children who grew up in those tenements and survived into adulthood, many of them went on to become teachers, union organisers, politicians, writers, artists. The labour movement of the early 20th century was built substantially on the anger and the memory of people who had been children in those apartments. People who knew from personal experience exactly what was being extracted from them and their families, and who decided at some point to stop accepting it. Clara Lemlich was one of them. She came from Ukraine, grew up in a Lower East Side tenement, worked in the garment factories as a teenager, and in 1909 stood up at a massive workers' meeting at Cooper Union and gave a speech in Yiddish, translated on the spot, that launched the largest women's labour strike in American history up to that point. 20,000 workers walked out. For 13 weeks. She was 23 years old. She'd been doing this kind of work since she was a child. There is a question that I keep turning over when I think about what it meant to be a child in these buildings. What does it do to you, not just economically, not just physically, but internally, psychologically, to be a child whose labour is necessary, not appreciated, necessary? There is a difference. A child whose help is appreciated still knows somewhere that their presence is a gift. A child whose labour is necessary knows somewhere that their presence is a function. I am not saying that immigrant families did not love their children. They did fiercely, and the evidence is everywhere in the record. But the structure of that love was shaped by economic pressure in ways that left marks. The children knew. Even the youngest ones knew, in the way that children always know the things adults try to hide, that the household depended on what they produced. New York State passed compulsory education laws in 1874 and again in 1894. Both times the laws were real, and both times without funding to actually enforce them, without truancy officers, without a mechanism to investigate home-based labour, without any requirement that landlords or employers cooperate with inspectors. The laws were largely symbolic. You could write a law saying every child must go to school. But if the family doesn't eat unless the child stays home and wraps wire into flower stems, the law is just words on paper. It took decades. It took organized labor, investigative journalism, the work of nurses and social workers and muckrakers and photographers. It took a series of disasters, some of them literally catastrophically fiery, to shift the needle. And even then it shifted slowly. One more thing before we move forward, because I think it needs to be said. In 1870, by the census count, 1 in 8 American children was working. By 1900, more than 1 in 5. And by 1920, after decades of reform legislation, Labour organising the work of every reformer we have discussed, and many we haven't, that number had finally measurably begun to decline. Not because the factories became kinder, not because the landlord suddenly developed a conscience, but because enough people, enough ordinary people who'd been children in those apartments, who had carried flower stems and newsprint and buckets of water up stairwells, decided that the generation coming after them deserved something different. And they fought for it, with their voices, with their feet, with their bodies on picket lines. That is how things change, not from the top down, from the ground up, from the people who know the ground best because they have been living on it their entire lives. So we have spent time now inside the apartment, inside the workshop, inside the childhood. But there is a dimension of tenement life that we have not yet properly examined, one that connects all of these stories together in a way that is both intimate and devastating. It moved silently through every building on the Lower East Side. It did not care whether you were Irish or Italian or Jewish or German. It had no interest in your hopes or your piecework or how many floors up you lived. It was disease. And in the cramped, dark, waterless, airless world of the 19th century tenement, it found conditions more hospitable than almost anywhere else on earth. The numbers, when you hear them, will stop you cold. And the specific story of how tuberculosis moved through these buildings, how it spread, how it was understood, and how slowly the city came to understand what was actually happening, is one of the most quietly harrowing chapters in this entire story. That is exactly where we go next. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a tenement building when sickness has arrived. You can feel it in the accounts people left behind. A certain heaviness. The sounds that stop the machine, the children's voices in the stairwell, the usual morning noise of a building waking up, and then the other sounds that begin. The kind you pretend not to hear through thin walls. Tuberculosis did not announce itself. That was perhaps the most insidious thing about it. Cholera, which swept through New York in waves, 1832, 1849, 1866, came fast and loud and obvious. One day a person was standing at the water pump. 3 days later, they were gone. It was terrifying, but it was legible. You could see it moving. You could point to a street and say it started there. Tuberculosis was different. Tuberculosis crept. It entered the body quietly, sometimes years before it announced its presence. It spread in the invisible space between one person's breath and another person's lungs. And in a tenement apartment, 3 rooms, 10 people, no ventilation, no sunlight, it found conditions that a disease pathogen could only dream of. Let me give you the number that I think changes how you understand this entire story. By the late 19th century, researchers estimated that between 70 and 90% of the urban populations of Europe and North America were infected with the tuberculosis bacterium, not sick from it, infected, carrying it. Most people's immune systems suppressed it. It sat dormant waiting, and in healthy people with adequate food and rest and fresh air, it often stayed dormant forever. But in people whose immune systems were weakened by overwork, by malnutrition, by the relentless physical stress of hauling water and sewing hems and sleeping in shifts in rooms without windows it activated. The tuberculosis bacteria, once active, destroyed lung tissue slowly. It produced what people called the graveyard cough, a deep, persistent, wet cough that once you had heard it, you recognized. It produced fever at night, sweating, the gradual wasting of the body. It killed slowly enough that you could watch it happening, and it was responsible at its peak in New York City for somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 deaths per year in a single city, in a single year. Now here is the part of this story that I find genuinely remarkable, in a way that says something important about how human beings understand and misunderstand the world they live in. For most of the 19th century, the medical establishment did not know what caused tuberculosis. Or more precisely, they had theories. And those theories were wrong, and the wrongness of those theories had consequences that were measured in lives. The dominant theory of disease transmission for most of the century was called miasma theory. The idea was ancient. It traced back to the Greeks through the Romans, through medieval Europe, and into the modern era, and it held that disease was caused by bad air, specifically by air polluted by decaying organic matter. The word miasma itself comes from a Greek root meaning pollution or stain. Under this theory, disease came from smelling something rotting, from proximity to sewage, from the corrupted air that hung over swamps and garbage heaps. And here is the darkest irony of miasma theory. It was not entirely wrong. Proximity to decaying organic matter did correlate with disease outbreaks. The miasmatists pointed to the Lower East Side and said, look, disease is rampant here, and the air is terrible, and there is garbage in the streets. All of those things were true, but they had identified the correlation without understanding the cause. The disease was not in the air. The disease was in the water contaminated by the waste. The disease was in the breath of the sick person sitting 3 feet away from you. The disease was in the bacteria, the actual living microscopic bacteria. That germ theory, still a fringe idea for much of the century, would eventually prove. Robert Koch, a German physician and scientist, announced his discovery of the tuberculosis bacterium in 1882. The specific bacterium, the actual cause. And even after that, even after the mechanism was understood, the full implications took years to filter down into policy and practice. Because here is the thing about deeply held beliefs. They do not dissolve when contradicted. They resist and find workarounds and seek confirming evidence. In New York City, when the Department of Health under physician Herman Biggs finally launched a formal campaign against tuberculosis in the 1890s, requiring doctors to report cases, establishing clinics, distributing educational leaflets about how the disease actually spread, private physicians resisted registering their patients. They did not want their wealthy patients' names associated with a disease that was publicly coded as an immigrant disease, a poverty disease, a disease of the tenements. Because this is the other layer of the story that gets too little attention. Alongside the miasma theory, which blamed the air, ran a parallel set of ideas that blamed the people. Immigrants were dirty. Immigrants were diseased by nature. Immigrants brought contagion with them from the old country. Their poverty was a symptom of their moral character, and their illness was a symptom of their poverty, and the whole thing was basically their own fault. These ideas were not fringe beliefs held by eccentric cranks. They were stated by physicians, politicians, journalists, and public health officials. They were published in newspapers. They were cited in policy arguments. And they had a specific lethal practical consequence. If you believe that disease comes from the character of the people, rather than from the conditions they live in, you will not be moved to change the conditions. You will be moved at most to quarantine or exclude the people, which is exactly what happened. Immigrants arriving at Ellis Island were inspected for signs of disease and turned away if found. People in the tenements who tested positive for tuberculosis were pressured, sometimes forced into isolation wards. The conditions that made the disease inevitable were largely left unchanged, because changing them would have required acknowledging that the landlord system, the grid plan, the absence of plumbing and light and air, that these were the real causes, and that acknowledgement had costs. Here is something I want to ask you directly because I think it is one of the most important questions this story raises. How much of what you believe about your own health and well-being is shaped by the conditions you live in rather than the choices you make? We live in an era that is deeply in love with individual agency, with the idea that if you eat the right things, sleep the right way, exercise correctly, manage your stress, you control your outcomes. And there is truth in that. There is genuine, real, documented truth in personal health choices. But the 19th century tenement is a useful corrective to the idea that individual choice is the whole story. A woman who developed tuberculosis on the Lower East Side in 1890 did not develop it because she made bad choices. She developed it because she lived in a room with 10 people, no sunlight, no ventilation, inadequate food, and chronic physical stress, because that was the only housing available to her at any price she could afford, and because a building code that might have required windows and adequate air had been fought off by landlords whose profits depended on the status quo. Her choices operated within a set of conditions she did not choose, and the diseases that found her operated within those same conditions. This is not a political statement. It is a historical fact, and I think history deserves to be read honestly. Let me tell you about the cholera of 1849 because it illustrates something important about how disease and blame worked in 19th century New York. The cholera epidemic of that year killed more than 5,000 people in New York City. Most of them were poor. Most of them were immigrants. And the dominant response from the established medical and civic community was not primarily sympathy. It was the suggestion that the victims had brought it on themselves. A New York newspaper editorial from that period attributed the epidemic's concentration in immigrant neighborhoods to what it called the sinful behavior and moral degradation of the Irish and German poor. Several prominent physicians publicly stated that the immigrants' manner of living their diet, their habits, their supposed indifference to cleanliness was the primary cause. Now set aside for a moment the cruelty of blaming dying people for their own deaths. Zoom in on the mechanism. The cholera epidemic of 1849 in New York was centered in neighborhoods that shared a water supply contaminated by human waste. A physician named John Snow had already been developing evidence in London that cholera spread through contaminated water, not through bad air. His work was published that very year, 1849, but it was ignored, and the immigrants of the Lower East Side continued sharing water taps in their backyards, taps fed by the Croton Aqueduct, which was an improvement, but which in many buildings fed into systems that were not adequately separated from the privy waste in the same yards. The miasma theorists looked at the same evidence, the concentration of disease in crowded, filthy neighborhoods, and came to the wrong conclusion. Not because they were stupid, because the wrong conclusion was convenient. It took until the 1860s, the 1870s, and ultimately the landmark work of Robert Koch in the 1880s, before the germ theory of disease became established enough to change practice. By that time, more than 3.5 decades of cholera outbreaks had come and gone in New York, each one killing thousands. Each one blamed at least in part on the people who had the bad fortune to live in buildings without adequate water or sanitation. There is one more disease I want to mention because it is so specific to the tenement environment that it almost functions as a metaphor. You may have heard earlier when we were talking about the buildings themselves about something called the tuberculosis window. That small interior window installed between rooms mandated by a city law in the 1880s that was meant to allow cross-ventilation to reduce the spread of tuberculosis. The landlord's response to this requirement was characteristically to find the cheapest possible compliance. They installed windows between interior rooms, which opened not onto the outside, not onto fresh air, but onto the next room in the same apartment, which was also occupied, which was also closed. So the tuberculosis window created cross-ventilation between one sealed room and another sealed room, in a building where the person in the first room was quite possibly already infected. It is possible to read this as a metaphor so perfect it seems invented. The solution that circulates the problem, the reform that reinforces the condition it was meant to address. Except it was not invented. It was real. Those windows still exist in some New York City apartments today. Small rectangular cutouts between rooms painted over now their origins forgotten by the people who live with them. Let me end this part of the story with something that I want to stay with you. There is a nurse named Lillian Wald who set up a visiting nurse service on Henry Street in the 1890s. She went into the tenements, into the actual apartments. She sat by the bedsides of the sick. She saw what tuberculosis looked like up close in a room with 7 other people and no working window. And she wrote something that I have been thinking about ever since I first read it. She wrote that the difference between the sick poor and the sick wealthy was not primarily a difference in medicine. It was a difference in air, in light, in the ability to rest, in the presence of food, in the absence of the machine and the rent collector and the constant underlying arithmetic of not enough. The body, she wrote, needs the same things whether it is rich or poor. It needs air, it needs light, it needs rest, it needs food. What poverty does is not make the body weaker in some fundamental biological sense. What poverty does is remove systematically and continuously the conditions under which the body can heal itself. That observation made by a visiting nurse in a tenement apartment in 1890-something is one of the most precise and important things I have ever read about the relationship between the way we house people and the way they live and die. And it is as true right now as it was then. We've spent time now in the sickness, the silent, slow, invisible kind that move through walls. But there was another way that death came to the tenement. This one was anything but silent. It arrived with light, with heat, with a speed that left no time for thought or preparation. Fire, and the story of fire in the tenement buildings of the Lower East Side, how easily it started, how fast it moved, what the response looked like, and what it eventually cost in lives before anyone with real power decided to do something about it, is a story that leads us directly to one of the most consequential events in the history of American labor. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, March 25, 1911. And the 146 people who never came home. If you want to understand what held the tenement world together, what kept people going through the darkness and the disease and the sewing machine and the rent collector and all the rest of it, start with food. Not the absence of it, which is part of the story, but the presence of it, the smell of it. The extraordinary, stubborn, culturally defiant act of cooking something delicious in a 3-room apartment with a coal stove and no running water, and a family of 10 to feed on wages that barely covered the rent. Because here is something that gets lost in the standard telling of this history. The tenement was not just a place of suffering. It was also, at least for part of every day, a place that smelled like something your grandmother made. Let me tell you about the food of the Lower East Side, because it is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in all of American culinary history. Every major immigrant group that lived in those buildings brought something with them. Not in suitcases, most of them had almost nothing in their suitcases, but in their heads, in the muscle memory of their hands, in the specific irreplaceable knowledge of how to take very little and make it into something worth eating. The German families who arrived earlier in the century brought sausage knowledge and the instinct for fermentation, that would eventually give New York its delicatessen culture. The Irish families who came in the famine years brought potato cooking refined by generations of necessity into something almost alchemical. The Italian immigrants, mostly from the south, from Sicily and Calabria, and the Mezzogiorno brought tomato knowledge and olive oil, and the particular genius of cucina povera, the cuisine of the poor, which is the art of making a rich flavour from inexpensive ingredients. And the Eastern European Jewish families who arrived in the largest numbers in the last 2 decades of the 19th century brought pickles. They brought the entire taxonomy of preservation, brine, salt, vinegar, fermentation. They brought herring in 17 different preparations. They brought the knowledge that fat is warmth and warmth is survival, and you render every bit of it. A food historian who studied the culinary life of 97 Orchard Street, that building we have visited several times now, noted something that I think says everything about how this community worked. Food, she wrote, was always moving through the building. If a family had a death, neighbours sent pots of soup. If a child was sick, someone's mother from the 3rd floor appeared at the door with something warm. If one family had a windfall, a good week at the machine, an unexpected commission, they cooked more than they needed, and let the smell drift down the stairwell as a kind of invitation. The building was a single organism in that sense, and food was its circulatory system. Now here is the thing about cooking in a tenement that most people do not consider. You could not simply decide to make dinner at 6 o'clock. There was no refrigerator. There was no pantry full of ingredients. There was the pushcart market outside. And the pushcart market was one of the most remarkable commercial phenomena in 19th century America. By 1900, there were roughly 2,500 pushcarts operating on the streets of the Lower East Side. 2,500 individual vendors, each with their own cart, their own specialty, their own spot on the street that they defended with territorial commitment and, when necessary, genuine physical force. They sold everything a tenement household needed. Fresh fish, herring most prominently, but also pike, carp, whitefish. Vegetables, potatoes, onions, cabbage, beets, carrots. Bread from the bakeries that opened before dawn and sold whatever was left from the previous day at reduced prices. Pickles from barrels scooped out and sold by the piece. Coal for the stove, kindling wood, kerosene for the lamps. The first pushcarts appeared on Hester Street in 1866, according to a city report from much later. By the time the immigrant waves of the 1880s and 90s arrived, the street market had become so dense that moving through it required a kind of choreography. The noise was extraordinary. The sellers called out their wares in Yiddish, Italian, Polish, German, English. Housewives negotiated. Children darted between the carts. Horse-drawn delivery wagons tried to push through and were largely ignored. And here is the thing about the pushcart economy that I want you to sit with for a moment. It was not formal. It was not regulated. It had almost no infrastructure. It was just people, mostly immigrants, mostly recent arrivals, mostly operating on very thin margins, selling to other people who had very little money. A woman on the 4th floor of a tenement building could not afford to buy in quantity. She could not afford to buy a whole chicken. She might be able to afford a chicken neck, or the feet, or the liver, and the pushcart vendors understood this perfectly. They sold in the smallest possible quantities, a handful of potatoes, a single herring, a penny's worth of salt. The market calibrated itself to the deepest poverty with remarkable precision, which brings me to a story that I have been saving for this moment. Because what happened on the Lower East Side in May of 1902 is one of the most extraordinary episodes in all of American consumer history, and it is almost completely forgotten outside of the communities that lived it. It begins as so many things in the tenement world begin with money, specifically with meat. For the observant Jewish families of the Lower East Side, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, kosher dietary laws were not optional. They were not a tradition you maintained when convenient. They were a fundamental part of who you were and how you lived. And the central requirement of those laws when it came to meat was that the animal had to be slaughtered according to a specific religious process by a certified butcher, which meant you could not simply switch to a cheaper butcher or buy non-kosher meat if prices went up. You could eat no meat or you could eat kosher meat, and those were essentially your options. In the spring of 1902, a syndicate of meat wholesalers, the kind of business combination that the Gilded Age was notorious for producing, coordinated a price increase. Kosher meat went from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound. That is a 50% increase, overnight, for a family bringing home roughly $10 a week, which was the average for a working man on the Lower East Side in 1902. This was the difference between eating and not eating. The kosher butchers tried first. They organized a boycott of the wholesalers who refused to buy meat, closed their shops. It lasted 5 days. The Beef Trust, as it was called, waited them out. The butchers had rent to pay. They folded, and that was when something remarkable happened. 3 women who lived in the same tenement building, Sarah Edelson, Fanny Levy, and Paulina Finkel, put an advertisement in a Yiddish newspaper. They called a meeting. They expected perhaps 50 women. 500 showed up. What happened next is one of those episodes in history that the people who experienced it understood perfectly well, but that subsequent generations have allowed to fade into footnote. On the morning of May 15th, 20,000 women poured into the streets of the Lower East Side. 20,000. They moved through the neighborhood in groups visiting every kosher butcher shop on Orchard Street, and there were 27 of them between Houston and Canal Street alone. They poured kerosene on cuts of meat displayed in the windows. They threw meat into the street. They blocked the entrances to shops. The police were called. 85 people were arrested. About 75 of them were women. A judge looking at the dock full of housewives in their market clothes asked what on earth had gotten into them. One woman reportedly replied in her best English that her husband was sick and her children were hungry and the price of meat had gone up 50%, and she was asking the court to explain what she was supposed to do. The judge, by some accounts, had no particularly good answer. Now here is what I find genuinely remarkable about this story. These women were not union organizers. They were not professional agitators. They were not people who had been trained in any kind of political movement. Most of them were in their 30s. Most of them had been in America for years, not recently arrived. They had watched and absorbed how things worked in this new country. They had watched the labor movement organizing in the factories. They had watched the suffrage movement beginning to find its voice. And they decided in the spring of 1902 that the same principles applied to them. They called their organization the Ladies' Anti-Beef Trust Association. They elected officers. They formed committees. They distributed leaflets with skulls and crossbones that warned the community not to buy meat, while the trust was taking food from women and children. They went door to door checking people's pots. This is real. This actually happened to make sure no one was secretly cooking meat they had bought from a butcher in defiance of the boycott. Someone caught with meat in a pot was called a scab. 3 weeks into the boycott, the Beef Trust blinked. They dropped the price back to 14 cents a pound. Not 12, not all the way, but down. And the women stopped, declared a qualified victory, and went home to cook. But here is what the story really is when you look at it from a distance. Those women did not simply win a 3-cent reduction in the price of meat. They demonstrated for the first time in any organized way that the people who lived in those tenements, the people who had no formal political power, no vote in most cases, no access to the levers of municipal authority, could move the market. The boycott of 1902 became a template. In 1904, the same community organized a rent strike. In 1907 and again in 1910, more food boycotts. and many of the women who marched in these streets in May of 1902 would send their daughters into the garment factories in the years that followed. Those daughters would remember what their mothers had done, and in November of 1909 they would launch the largest women's labour strike in American history. Clara Lemlich, whose name we mentioned earlier, had grown up in this world. She had watched, she had learned. And when she stood up at Cooper Union and called for a general strike in 1909, she was not inventing something new. She was continuing something her mother's generation had already begun. Let me bring this back to the table quite literally. Cabbage, potatoes, bread. Those three things were the foundation of almost every immigrant family's diet on the Lower East Side, regardless of ethnicity or religion or country of origin. A food historian who studied the culinary life of the tenements described it this way, connected by their poverty. Cabbage, potatoes and bread were staples, and wherever you were from you depended on these. The average Irishman's daily diet in the years just after the famine included roughly 12 pounds of potatoes. That is not a misprint. 12 pounds. The potato was breakfast, lunch and dinner, occasionally accompanied by buttermilk, occasionally by a small bit of salt fish if the week had been particularly good. The German families used their potato knowledge differently. Fermentation sauerkraut, the long autumn tradition of the cabbage shaver, who would travel through buildings helping families put up enough fermented cabbage to last the winter. The Italian families stretched tomatoes and olive oil and whatever vegetables survived the pushcart market at the end of the day, when prices dropped and the bruised and wilting produce could be had for almost nothing. And the Eastern European Jewish families, perhaps the most skilled practitioners of making something from almost nothing, turned chicken feet and beef bones and scraps of organ meat and stale bread into dishes that were genuinely objectively delicious. Not in spite of the poverty, because of it. Because when you have very little, you develop a relationship with your ingredients that is very different from what you have when you have plenty. You learn the specific flavour that a beef bone gives to water after 4 hours of simmering. You learn what to do with the green tops of carrots. You learn that a single herring properly prepared can season a pot of potatoes for a whole family. And here is my personal observation offered with the appropriate humility. Much of what we consider distinctly New York food, the deli sandwich, the pickle, the pastrami, the knish, the Italian-American pasta sauce, the specific emotional weight of certain comfort foods was born in those tenement kitchens, not in restaurants, not in cooking schools, in three-room apartments on the Lower East Side in the glow of a coal stove by women who had no cookbooks and no formal training and no adequate lighting and no running water, and still somehow produced food that their grandchildren remember 60 years later with a specific, irreducible longing. That is a form of genius. I genuinely believe that. It is an unacknowledged, undecorated, uncelebrated genius that fed a city and changed American food forever. But food also tells you something else about the tenement world that matters for this story. It tells you where the power actually lived. Not in the offices of the landlords, not in the shops of the bosses, but in the kitchens, in the hands of the women who managed the household budget down to the last penny, who decided what the family ate, who knew with precision what things cost and what they should cost, and what they could reasonably afford. When the price of kosher meat went up 50% in 1902, the women of the Lower East Side did not petition. They did not ask permission. They acted, and they won. That is not a small thing. In a world that gave them almost no formal power, they found the leverage, they had the power of collective refusal, and they used it. The street, the pushcart, the kitchen, the boycott. These are the stories that usually get compressed into a single sentence in the history books. Immigrants lived in crowded tenements. They cooked traditional food. They worked hard and eventually moved to better neighborhoods. But the life inside those sentences, the 12 pounds of potatoes, the 500 women who showed up when only 50 were expected, the kerosene on the meat, the judge with no good answer, that life is worth slowing down for. Because it is not just history, it is the architecture of the city you live in right now. The food, the organising, the stubborn insistence on dignity, even in the smallest things. All of it is still here if you know where to look. We have been inside the tenement now for a long time. We have seen its architecture, its rooms, its water and its light and its dark. We have sat at its table. We have heard its children. We have felt the weight of its sickness. We have watched the women in its streets. There is one person we've not yet properly met, a man with a camera, an immigrant himself, which matters for the story he would tell, a man who understood from personal experience what it meant to be alone in a city that did not particularly want you. His name was Jacob Riis, and what he did, the specific way he used light and glass and silver nitrate, and an absolute refusal to look away, would change American history. That is where we go right now. Here is a fact that I find almost unbearably poignant given everything that came after. When Jacob Riis arrived in New York City on June 5, 1870, he was 21 years old. He had $40 in his pocket. He had a locket containing a strand of hair from a girl named Elizabeth, who had turned him down, and he had absolutely no idea what he was going to do next. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person whose story we've been telling for the past several hours. A young immigrant alone in a city that did not particularly want him trying to figure out how to survive. The difference is that Jacob Riis eventually found a way to tell the story of everyone else who came after him. Let me give you a proper introduction to this man. Not the statue version, not the legend, the actual person. He was born in Riis, Denmark, a small coastal town in 1849. He was the third of 15 children. His father was a schoolteacher and a writer for the local newspaper, which perhaps explains something about where Jacob's instincts eventually led him. At 16, he fell in love with a girl named Elizabeth. She rejected him. He moved to Copenhagen. He worked as a carpenter. He was miserable. And at 21, with a rejection still fresh, and Denmark offering nothing that looked like a future, he bought a steerage ticket on a steamship, told almost no one he was leaving, and sailed for America. The crossing took 3 weeks. He travelled below the waterline with hundreds of other passengers in the kind of conditions that have been described many times in this story already. He arrived at the port of New York, spent $20 of his 40 on a revolver, a decision that says something about what he had heard about the city he was arriving in, and stepped onto the street. What followed was 3 years of something close to what the people in those tenements knew every day. He could not find steady work. He drifted through Pennsylvania, New Jersey, back to New York. He worked as a carpenter, an iron worker, a bricklayer, a farmer, a coal miner, a salesman of maps. He slept wherever he could, in barns, in cheap lodging houses, in the police stations that kept a few cots available for the destitute. And in one of those police lodging houses, a place he would spend years trying to get shut down once he had the power to do it, something happened that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He had a small locket. The locket contained the strand of hair from Elizabeth. In the lodging house, someone stole it from him while he slept. He reported the theft to the policeman on duty. The policeman did not believe him. He was thrown out of the building. As he left, the policeman's dog, which apparently felt the same way about the situation as its owner, bit him. He stood in the street in the dark and thought about what it meant to be a person in this city with no money and no connections and no one to believe you when something was taken from you. He never forgot that feeling, and everything he did for the rest of his career was in some way an attempt to make sure other people did not have to feel it without anyone noticing. By 1873 he had found newspaper work. By 1876, Elizabeth, who had apparently reconsidered, agreed to marry him. He went back to Denmark for the wedding, brought her to New York and settled in Brooklyn. He became a police reporter, which in late 19th century New York meant that his beat was the worst neighborhoods in the city. The places where the poverty was most concentrated, the crime most visible, the suffering most acute. He walked those streets for years, not occasionally, every day, every night. He went into the buildings. He knew the people, not as statistics, as neighbors, as the man on Baxter Street who made cigars in his kitchen, as the woman on Mulberry Street who took in laundry and had 7 children, as the boys sleeping on the grates, and he wrote about them. He wrote well in a style that was vivid and urgent and deeply personal. People read his articles, but something was wrong. The articles were not enough. He could describe a room. He could describe the smell, the darkness, the number of people sleeping on a floor. But the readers of those articles were largely comfortable, largely middle class. And the distance between reading a description of a dark room and actually understanding what a dark room means, when it is also your home and your workplace and the place where your children sleep, that distance Riis found was almost impossible to bridge with words alone. He needed to show people. Here is where the story takes a turn that is almost too perfectly constructed for a history that was actually lived. In early 1887, Jacob Riis was having breakfast with his wife in their home in Brooklyn when he opened the newspaper and read a 4-line dispatch. 4 lines. 2 German scientists, Adolf Meter and Johannes Geidecke, had developed a technique for taking photographs in low-light conditions. They had mixed magnesium powder with potassium chlorate. When the mixture was ignited, it produced a sudden, intense burst of brilliant white light. They called it Blitzlicht, flashlight. Now Riis was not a photographer. He had tried photography before and found that the slow lenses of the era, combined with the fact that tenement interiors had almost no natural light, made the camera essentially useless for what he needed. But the German innovation changed that equation entirely. He set down his coffee. He thought about what he had just read. And then he went and found 2 amateur photographer friends, Dr. Henry G. Pifford and Richard Ho Lawrence, and explained to them what he was thinking. They would go into the buildings at night. With this new flash technology, they would photograph what was actually there. I want you to think about what it would have felt like to be in one of those tenement apartments when Jacob Riis and his colleagues arrived. It is 2 a.m. You're asleep or trying to sleep in a room with 6 other people. The room is dark. The building is quiet except for the usual nocturnal sounds of a tenement, someone coughing 2 floors up, a baby stirring in the room next door, the distant sound of the street. The door opens. A group of men enter carrying equipment you've never seen before. A camera on a stand. A frying pan because Riis, having found the pistol-like flash device too dangerous after setting his own bedding on fire on at least one occasion, had taken to igniting the magnesium powder in a frying pan held up at shoulder height. The men set up. One of them holds up the frying pan. A match strikes. And then a blast of white light, brighter than anything that room has ever experienced, brighter than noon on a summer day, floods every corner of the space for a fraction of a second. The people in the room jolt awake, startled, blinking. The camera captures what it sees, and then the men are gone. Riis later wrote that subjects were sometimes so startled by the flash that the resulting photographs showed people mid-leap, frozen in the moment of being violently woken by an explosion of light in a room that had never once in its existence been brightly lit. There is something about that image, a room that has never been bright, suddenly illuminated for a fraction of a second, that feels to me like a metaphor for the entire project. The tenements existed in darkness, literally, physically, because they had no windows or inadequate ones, and figuratively because the middle class and wealthy populations of New York City, the people with the political power to change things, did not know what was inside those rooms, did not want to know, did not look. Jacob Riis pointed a frying pan full of burning magnesium powder at the darkness and refused to let it stay dark. The first published report appeared in the New York Sun in February of 1888. The headline described pictures taken in dark places by the lightning process. The piece was accompanied by 12 drawings made from the photographs because half-tone printing technology, which would allow actual photographs to be reproduced in newspapers, was still being developed. But the photographs themselves, shown as lantern slides in lectures at churches and schools and reform societies, hit audiences like nothing they had experienced before. Riis had figured something out that most people only understand in retrospect. Reading about misery creates sympathy. Seeing misery creates something more urgent. When an audience in a church hall in Brooklyn saw a slide projection of a room 13 feet across with 12 adults sleeping on the floor, a room Riis had actually photographed that actually existed, that you could walk to from that church hall in under an hour, the reaction was visceral in a way that no article had ever produced. Some people wept. Some people looked away. Some people sat in silence for a long time afterward. And some people with genuine power to change things began to think about whether they should. In 1890, Charles Scribner's sons published the book. How the Other Half Lives Studies Among the Tenements of New York. It contained Riis's writing and reproductions of his photographs, some of them photographic reproductions of the actual glass plate negatives, some of them drawings based on the photographs because the technology was still catching up to the vision. The book documented with specific addresses and dates and interviews and statistics the conditions inside the buildings of the Lower East Side. It named neighborhoods. It described rooms. It quoted the people who lived in them. And here is the fact about the book that I want you to sit with. The infant mortality rate in the tenements Riis reported had reached 1 in 10. 12 adults regularly slept in a room 13 feet across. By the late 1880s, more than 300,000 people lived in a single square mile of the Lower East Side, a density Riis wrote, that exceeded any other place on earth. Those facts had existed before the book was published. Social reformers knew them. Health officials knew them. The city government in the abstract knew them. But they had existed in reports, in surveys, in the kind of document that sits on a shelf and is cited in other documents. When those same facts appeared alongside photographs of actual human faces in actual dark rooms, something shifted. Now I want to be honest about Jacob Riis because I think the full story matters. He was not a perfect person. He was a man of his time with the prejudices of his time, and some of those prejudices are on display in the text of How the Other Half Lives, in ways that are genuinely uncomfortable to read today. He held ethnic stereotypes about many of the immigrant communities he wrote about. He applied generalizations to entire nationalities that were unfair and sometimes insulting. He believed in assimilation as an unquestioned good, and his definition of what it meant to be a proper American was narrower than we would accept today. I am not raising this to diminish him. I am raising it because I think it is important to hold the complexity. A person can do genuinely important, genuinely compassionate work that changes the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, while also carrying within them the biases of their era. Those biases matter. They shaped what he photographed and what he didn't, whose story he told and how. But the work was real. The impact was real, because here is what happened after the book was published. A young civil service commissioner in New York City read it. He was 31 years old, ambitious, energetic, and by his own account completely unprepared for what the book contained. He walked into Jacob Riis's newspaper office. He left a card. The card read, "I have read your book, and I have come to help." His name was Theodore Roosevelt, and what followed the late-night walks through the tenements, The political pressure, the series of reforms that began to accumulate in the 1890s, was one of the most consequential partnerships between journalism and power in American political history. Roosevelt, as New York's police commissioner, closed the worst of the city's police lodging houses, the very places that Riis had slept in as a homeless immigrant 20 years earlier. He pushed for new housing standards. He supported the investigations that would lead eventually to the Tenement House Act of 1901. I find the arc of that story remarkable. A 21-year-old immigrant rejected by a girl unemployed sleeping in a police lodging house with all his possessions stolen from him in the night becomes the journalist who photographs the darkest rooms in the city, becomes the friend and collaborator of the future President of the United States, and leaves behind a New York that is in specific and measurable ways less dark than the one he arrived in. There is a question I've been thinking about ever since I started working through this history. What would we know about the tenement world? What would the people who lived in it be able to tell us if Jacob Riis had not existed? If the flash powder had not been invented? If that breakfast in Brooklyn had not happened? If the 4-line dispatch from Germany had appeared in a different newspaper on a different day? I do not ask this to suggest that Riis was uniquely irreplaceable. History does not work that way. Other photographers would have emerged. Other journalists would have found their way into those buildings eventually. But there is something specific about what Riis did that matters. He did not photograph the tenements as an outsider looking in. He photographed them as someone who'd been inside, who had slept on those floors, who had felt personally the particular indignity of having something taken from you in the dark with no one to believe you. That difference shows in the photographs. The people in his images are not specimens. They are not curiosities. They are people caught in a specific moment in a specific room by a man who understood what that room cost them. And he carried that understanding all the way from a police lodging house on a cold night in 1870 to the offices of the most powerful man in the world. Riis called his life work A Battle with the Slum. It was the title of his second major book. I have been thinking about that phrase, battle with the slum, and what it implies. Not battle with the poor, not battle against the immigrants, battle with the slum itself, with the system that produced it, with the conditions, not the people. That framing was not universal in his time. Many people saw the residents of the tenements as the problem. Riis insisted year after year, photograph after photograph, article after article, that the buildings were the problem, the system was the problem, the people were the evidence. And that insistence, that stubborn photographically documented insistence, changed the terms of the conversation. Not immediately, not completely, but enough. Enough that by 1901 the city finally passed a law that required windows in every room, running water in every apartment, indoor toilets for every family, and minimum standards for fire safety. Enough that the world Riis photographed, the specific documented named world of those particular buildings on those particular streets, became illegal to build. But you know what's interesting? The buildings he photographed still stand. Right now, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, you can walk past the actual brick walls. You can see the actual windows or their absence. You can stand on the actual streets. And if you walk through enough of those blocks and look up at enough of those facades, you will start to notice something. The buildings are beautiful. Not beautiful in the way that erases their history, but beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have survived long enough to mean something. Every carved sandstone detail on a dumbbell tenement, every wrought iron fire escape, every worn brick staircase. All of it was put there by people who had nothing, who were building a city they would barely benefit from, who lived in conditions that we would not recognize as adequate housing today, and who, despite all of that, or perhaps because of all of that, made something that lasted. And so we are almost at the end of this story, but not quite. because we have spent this entire night in a particular world, a world that for all its darkness, for all its smoke and disease and rent collectors and sewing machines, was also a world of extraordinary vitality. The women of the tenements did not wait for someone to save them. They organized, they boycotted, they took to the streets with kerosene and righteous fury. The men of the tenements built the city with their hands and then organized to demand better conditions in the buildings they had built. The children of the tenements grew up to change American labor law, American food culture, American literature, American music. And throughout all of it, in the buildings that the light could not reach, in the rooms that smelled of coal smoke and cooking, and too many people too close together, people found ways to be human, to love, to cook, to sing, to laugh at things that should not have been funny and somehow were. That is the tenement story, not the suffering alone, the survival. And there is one final chapter I want to spend with you, the chapter about what happened to all of it, what happened to those buildings, those streets, those communities, what the reformers built in place of the tenement world, and what lessons, quiet, stubborn, historically documented lessons this entire story offers for the world we live in right now. That is where we go next. Something about this next story keeps stopping me every time I try to get through it quickly. Maybe because it starts with a child. It is the spring of 1893. A young nursing student named Lillian Wald is teaching a class on home health care to immigrant women at a school on the Lower East Side. She's 25 years old. She's from Rochester, New York. She grew up in a comfortable house, went to good schools, had advantages that the women in her class had never once in their lives possessed. She's teaching them how to make a proper bed. And then a small girl appears in the doorway. The child's mother has just given birth. Something has gone wrong. A doctor came and left without helping because the woman could not pay, and the little girl, with a kind of desperate practicality that children of the tenements developed early, has come to find whoever in that room might help. Lillian Wald set down her lesson notes. She followed the child out into the street. What she saw on that walk has been described in several accounts, always in Wald's own language, which was careful and specific, and did not reach for drama because the reality provided enough of its own. She was led over broken roadways, no asphalt in this neighborhood, though other parts of the city had it, between tall buildings whose fire escapes were jammed with household goods, through a courtyard, where the shared privies stood open and were used without partition by everyone, up a rear tenement staircase that was slimy underfoot, and finally into a sick room. She helped the woman, and then she stood in that room for a moment and looked at what surrounded her, and Lillian Wald made a decision. She later wrote that the morning was a baptism of fire. She left medical school, she never went back, she moved to the Lower East Side, and over the next 4 decades she built something that I think is one of the most quietly extraordinary institutions in the history of American public health. But before we talk about what she built, I want to spend a moment on something that I find genuinely fascinating about the world she entered. Because there is a dimension of the tenement story that we have been circling throughout this entire night without fully addressing. The women who lived in those buildings, not the women who came from outside to help Lillian Wald Jane Addams, the progressive reformers, the women who were already there, the ones whose story has been visible in glimpses throughout everything we have discussed, carrying water, making flowers, managing the household budget, to the penny organizing boycotts, but who have not yet been given their full due. I want to give it to them now. Here is something that does not appear in the standard history. In every tenement building on the Lower East Side, there were girls who were known by a specific name. Little mothers. Jacob Riis used the phrase. So did health reformers, settlement workers, school principals, journalists. A little mother was an adolescent girl, sometimes as young as 10 or 11, who was responsible for the care of her younger siblings, while her own mother worked. She was not a metaphor, she was a role, a specific recognized economically necessary role in the tenement household. She got the children up in the morning. She made sure they ate whatever there was to eat. She walked the younger ones to school if they were school age, then went to school herself if time permitted. She came home at lunch to check on the baby. She was there at the end of the school day, and in the afternoon, and in the evening. Riis wrote about one girl he encountered. She was described as about 12 years old, who'd been doing this work so long and so reliably that her younger siblings, who barely knew their own mother, would reach for this girl first when they were hurt or frightened. She had become in every practical sense the parent of the household, not because her mother was absent or indifferent, because the economics of survival in those buildings required that every available person contribute every available hour, and the little mother contributed hers. What I find most moving about this when I read the historical accounts is not the hardship of it. The hardship is obvious. It is the competence. These girls were extraordinarily competent. They managed households with no resources. They made decisions that had real consequences. They knew at 12 years old how to keep a sick child hydrated when there was no medicine and no doctor who would come without payment. They knew how to stretch a meal. They knew which neighbours could be counted on and which could not. And then they grew up and became the women of the tenement, who managed everything, knew everything, and were formally recognised for almost none of it. Lillian Wald understood this. That is, I think, the most important thing about her that distinguishes her from many of the reformers of her era. She did not enter the Lower East Side with the conviction that the people who lived there needed to be saved from themselves. She entered it with the conviction, and this was actually somewhat radical for her time, that the people who lived there were already doing extraordinary things under impossible conditions, and what they needed was not moral instruction but practical support. Running water, medical care, safe places for children to play, access to a nurse when someone was sick, not charity in the condescending sense, partnership in the practical sense, and that distinction shaped everything about what she built. Let me tell you about the nurses of Henry Street, because their story is remarkable, and almost nobody outside of New York City public health history knows it. By 1913, the Henry Street settlement the organisation Wald had built, starting from a single tenement apartment on Jefferson Street in 1893, had expanded to 7 buildings on Henry Street with 2 satellite centres. It had 3,000 members in its classes and clubs, and it had 92 nurses. 92 women making an estimated 200,000 home health calls per year. Think about what that means. 200,000 in a neighbourhood in a year. They went into the buildings, the actual apartments. They climbed the stairs 5 flights, 4 flights, 6 flights, sometimes carrying medical supplies, sometimes in snow or summer heat. They sat by bedsides. They demonstrated how to prevent transmission of contagious disease in a household with 10 people and 1 room. They made return visits when a patient was not improving. They charged what people could afford, which was often nothing, and they came anyway. One nurse was documented climbing across rooftops, literally traversing the building line from roof to roof to reach patients on upper floors without having to descend and climb multiple staircases. I want to be honest about something here. That image, a nurse crossing a Lower East Side rooftop at the turn of the 20th century with a medical bag, is not a metaphor. It is a documented fact, and I find it more impressive than almost anything in this story. Not because it was dramatic, because it was ordinary, because it was Tuesday, because that was just the work. There is a complexity to the settlement house movement that deserves to be acknowledged. Not every historian celebrates it uncritically. Some have noted correctly that settlement houses also carried with them a certain assumption about assimilation, that the immigrants needed to become more American, in specific culturally defined ways, and that part of what settlement workers did alongside the nursing and the education was push the residents of the tenements toward a version of middle-class Protestant American life that was not necessarily what those residents wanted for themselves. The Americanization classes the cooking classes that taught women to make American food instead of their own traditional dishes, the children's programs that sometimes subtly discouraged the use of immigrant languages, all of this is part of the history. Wald herself was more nuanced than many of her contemporaries on this. She genuinely respected the culture she encountered. The Henry Street settlement dining room had Russian samovars used because Wald wanted the Russian Jewish families of the neighborhood to feel at home there. She understood that the gifts these communities brought were not problems to be corrected, but the tension was real, and I think it is worth naming, because the story of the tenement is not a simple story of good, outside people helping innocent inside people. It is a more complicated story of power and knowledge and cultural assumption, in which genuine compassion and genuine condescension sometimes occupied the same room. What cannot be argued is the impact. By the time Lillian Wald left the settlement in 1933, she was ill. Her heart was failing. The landscape of public health in the United States had been permanently changed by what she had built and what she had demanded. She had started the first public school nursing program in American history in 1902. She had helped found the National Child Labor Committee, which eventually contributed to the laws that got children out of the factories. She had campaigned for women's suffrage. She had helped establish the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She had pushed successfully for the creation of the United States Children's Bureau within the Department of Labor in 1912, the first federal agency dedicated specifically to the welfare of children. All of this came from a woman who started by following a little girl through a broken-down courtyard to attend to a sick mother who could not pay a doctor. But here is what I find most remarkable about the legacy of the settlement house movement in general, and the Henry Street settlement in particular. It did not replace the community it served. It did not displace it. It did not move people out and build something else in the space they had occupied. It added to the community. It reinforced what was already there. The mutual aid networks that had existed in those buildings, the Landsmannschaften, the informal arrangements between neighbours, the women who watched each other's children and sent food when someone was sick, all of that continued. And around it, the settlement movement built a structure that could do the things informal networks could not. Negotiate with city officials, demand medical standards, train nurses, push legislation. It was in the best sense a partnership, not a rescue. I want to tell you about one more woman before we move on. She's appeared briefly in this story before, and she deserves a more proper introduction. Margaret Sanger worked as a visiting nurse at the Henry Street settlement in the early years of the 20th century. She walked those same tenement stairs. She sat in those same cramped apartments. She watched women have baby after baby, 7, 8, 9, 10 children in rooms with no running water and no privacy and no money to feed the children they already had. And she asked a question that nobody in polite society particularly wanted to hear. What if women had the ability to decide when and whether to have children? That question, emerging directly from those specific tenement apartments, from the specific reality of women's lives in those buildings, launched one of the most contentious and consequential public health debates in American history. I am not making a political statement here. The debate about reproductive rights has dimensions that go far beyond anything I intend to address tonight. But what I want to note is the specific origin of the question. It did not come from a lecture hall. It did not come from a philosophy seminar. It came from a woman walking up a rear tenement staircase in Lower Manhattan, seeing what she saw and refusing to look away from the implications. The tenement shaped the question. The woman shaped the answer she sought. and the world was changed by both. Here is something I want to ask you, and I mean it as a genuine question rather than a rhetorical one. When we talk about the women of the tenements, the little mothers and the boycott organisers, and the piecework sewers and the visiting nurses and the reformers, what do we notice about the structure of their influence? Almost none of them at the time they were doing the most important work of their lives had the right to vote. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which gave women the right to vote, was ratified in 1920. Most of the women in this story built their legacies before that year. They organised labour strikes. They founded public health institutions that still operate today. They changed housing law. They built the infrastructure of the modern social safety net without a vote. That is not a small thing to sit with. It means that what they accomplish through a combination of professional expertise, moral authority, community solidarity, and relentless, creative, tireless advocacy. Not through electoral power, not through formal representation, through the specific gravity of people who understand a problem better than anyone else and refuse to stop talking about it until something changes. The visiting nurses of Henry Street, the women of the kosher meat boycott, the little mothers of the Lower East Side, Clara Lemlich on the stage of Cooper Union, Lillian Wilde crossing a rooftop with a medical bag. These are the women of the tenement story. They did not wait for the city to notice them. They built what was needed. They fought for what was missing. They cared for what was sick. And in doing so, they changed not just the neighbourhood, but the country. And so we are nearing the end of this long night together. We've travelled far through the architecture and the darkness, the sewing machines and the push carts, the flash powder and the boycotts, the disease and the nurses who fought it. There is one more stop. The place where all of these stories converge, reform labour housing, the slow grinding work of making a city livable for the people who actually live in it into a single moment. A moment that happened on a Saturday afternoon in March. That lasted 18 minutes, and that produced a list of 146 names that changed American labour law forever. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, March 25th, 1911. And what happened in those 18 minutes is the story that connects everything we have discussed tonight to the world you're lying in right now. 4:15 in the afternoon, March 25th, 1911. A Saturday. The factory was winding down for the day. About 500 workers, mostly young women, mostly recent immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe, mostly between the ages of 14 and 23, were preparing to collect their paychecks and leave for the weekend. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the 8th, 9th and 10th floors of the Ash Building in Greenwich Village, a few blocks from Washington Square Park. The building was modern for its time, 10 stories of stone and steel built 9 years earlier, considered fireproof by the standards of the day. At approximately 20 minutes to 5, a scrap bin underneath one of the cutters' tables on the 8th floor began to burn. What happened next took exactly 18 minutes. I want you to understand what 18 minutes means in this context. It does not mean 18 minutes of manageable emergency. It does not mean 18 minutes in which help arrived and things were brought under control. It means 18 minutes of complete, escalating catastrophe with no exit. The fabric scraps in the bin, months of accumulated cotton, lint and tissue paper and thread cuttings caught instantly. Fabric burns fast. The fire spread across the 8th floor tables in seconds. Someone telephoned up to the 10th floor where the management offices were located. The people on the 10th floor were alerted and escaped to the roof where they were rescued. Nobody telephoned the 9th floor. The workers on the 9th floor, the floor with the largest number of people, the floor where most of the sewing machines were, did not know there was a fire until the smoke was already in the room. Now here is the thing that every account of this event returns to, the thing that transforms a terrible accident into a moral catastrophe. The doors were locked, not by accident, not by negligence in the careless sense, by policy. The owners of the Triangle factory, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, had a practice standard in garment factories of the era of locking the exits during working hours. The stated reason was to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks. The actual reason, more specifically documented, was that women had to leave the building to use the bathroom, and locking the doors prevented this disruption to productivity. An inspector had noted the violations before. The owners had been warned. Nothing had changed. So when the fire started on the 8th floor and the workers on the 9th floor finally understood what was happening and ran for the stairwell doors, the doors did not open. The workers pushed. They knocked. They pounded. Some of the doors opened inward, which meant a crowd pressing against them made them impossible to open. Some were simply locked. The fire escape, singular one fire escape for 500 people, was so narrow that a single file of terrified workers could just barely fit. And it collapsed. Under the heat, under the weight. It tore away from the wall and dropped its occupants 9 stories. The fire department arrived. Their ladders reached to the 6th floor. The fire was on the 8th, 9th, and 10th. Here is what I find almost unbearable about this story, and I want to say it simply. The people on the 9th floor knew they were going to die. Not in the abstract, not as a theoretical possibility. They knew in those final minutes in that burning room with the locked doors and the useless fire escape and the fire truck ladders that stopped 2 floors below them. They made decisions. Some of them tied their dresses and coats together and tried to climb down the outside of the building. Some of them got into the elevator, which made 4 trips before the heat made it impossible to operate. Some of them gathered at the windows, and 47 of them jumped. 47 people chose to fall rather than burn. Frances Perkins, who had become the first female cabinet member in American history, who had become Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, who would be one of the architects of the New Deal, was having tea with a friend in Washington Square Park when she heard the fire engines. She ran to the scene. She stood on the street below and watched. She later wrote that she could hear the firemen yelling to the workers not to jump, that the nets couldn't hold them from that height. The workers jumped anyway. Some of them were holding hands when they jumped. 2 of them, a young man and a young woman, embraced before stepping out of the window together. By 5 o'clock, by the time the building had been searched and the final count was taken, 146 people were dead. 123 of them were women. Most were between 16 and 23 years old. Many had come to America in the previous decade, fleeing the exact same forces that had brought every other generation of immigrants to those tenements and those factories. They had survived the crossing. They had survived the tenements. They had survived the sweating system and the piecework and the 12-hour days, and they died in a locked room on the 9th floor of a building that was supposed to be modern, in a city that was supposed to be progressive, in a country that was supposed to be the place where things were different. What happened in the days that followed is a story in itself, and I think it says something important about what ordinary people do when confronted with something they cannot simply accept. 3 days after the fire, a funeral procession moved through the streets of New York. An estimated 350,000 people lined the route. It was raining. The march lasted hours. Not a political rally. Not a protest with signs and speakers. A funeral. 350,000 people standing in the rain to say we see this. We will not pretend it did not happen. A week after the fire, a mass meeting at the Metropolitan Opera House demanded action on fire safety. People of every background crowded the hall. Rose Schneiderman, the union organizer, the young woman from the garment district, the daughter of the tenement world, spoke that night, and she said something that has been quoted and requoted ever since because it captures the moment with an accuracy that no more measured statement could match. She said that the working people had nothing but their lives, that rich people prized their belongings, their property, their investments, But the working person had nothing to lose but their life, and that apparently society was willing to let them lose that too. What we need, she said, is not condolences. What we need is not pity. What we need is the right to live. Let me tell you what happened to the owners. Max Blank and Isaac Harris were charged with manslaughter. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Their lawyers argued successfully that the owners could not have known the doors were locked at the moment the fire broke out. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, not guilty. The owners walked out of the courtroom. The families of the dead received eventually $75 each from an insurance settlement paid by the building owner, not the factory owners. The factory itself had been insured for roughly $60,000. The owners collected it. They actually made money on the fire. If you are feeling something right now, some heat in your chest, some particular quality of outrage, I want to tell you that it is historically accurate. That is the appropriate response to that information, even 114 years later. But here is the part of the story I find most extraordinary. Because of the fire, things changed. Not because the owners were punished. They weren't. Not because justice was done in any conventional sense, it wasn't. But because the fire made something visible that had always been true but had never been seen so clearly by so many people at the same moment. Frances Perkins, standing in the street that afternoon watching 47 people fall, she later said that was the day the New Deal was born. Think about the weight of that sentence. The New Deal, the Social Security Act, unemployment insurance, the 40-hour work week, the minimum wage, the right of workers to organize, the abolition of child labor, the regulatory framework that governs American workplaces today. All of it traces a direct line to a locked door on the 9th floor of a building in Greenwich Village on a Saturday afternoon in March, because Frances Perkins spent the next 22 years doing what she had seen needed to be done. 3 months after the fire, New York State created the Factory Investigating Commission, with Senators Robert Wagner and Alfred Smith, both sons of the tenement world, both politicians who had grown up in those same Lower East Side streets as its leaders. The commission investigated nearly 2,000 factories in the next 4 years. It produced 60 new laws, fire safety requirements, factory inspections, mandatory sprinkler systems, unlocked exits, limits on working hours for women and children, sanitation standards, the beginning in law of the idea that an employer has a responsibility to the physical safety of the people who work for them. In 13 years, Wagner and Smith and Perkins moved from that burning building to the Senate floor and the cabinet room, and from those positions they rewrote what American work looked like. I want to ask you something personal. Do you have a weekend? Do you work 40 hours a week or something close to it, with the understanding that hours beyond that deserve extra compensation? Do you work in a building with fire exits that are legally required to be unlocked? Does your employer carry workers' compensation insurance? Are you entitled to a minimum wage? Can you, if you choose, join a union without being fired for it? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, and for most people listening to this the answer is yes, then you are living inside a structure that was built in significant part by people who stood in the rain on the streets of Lower Manhattan in March of 1911 and refused to move on. That is not a metaphor. It is a direct, documented, historical causal chain. The locked door on the 9th floor led to the law that required the door to be unlocked. The women who fell from those windows led eventually to the floor on which you stand right now, metaphorically, and sometimes literally being governed by rules that say you cannot be asked to work in a room with no exit. There is one more thing I want to tell you about this story before we move on. The last survivor of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire was a woman named Rose Friedman. She was 17 years old on the day of the fire. She was 2 days away from her 18th birthday. She survived by following the factory management to the roof where she was rescued. She spent the rest of her life, which lasted until February of 2001, as a supporter of the labour movement. She was 107 years old when she died. She was alive in the same world as the internet, the same world as mobile phones. She outlived the 20th century by a few months, and when she died, she was the last living person who had stood in that room, the last person who had heard the pounding on the locked door, the last person who carried in her body the specific, irreducible personal memory of what it had been to be there. After her death, that knowledge passed into history, into archives, into books and documentaries and commemorative plaques, into laws. But most importantly, if we are paying attention, into the understanding that the conditions under which people work and live are not natural forces like weather or gravity. They are choices made by people with power or with money or with both, and they can be changed by people with neither if enough of them decide that the change is necessary. That is the lesson of the locked door. That is the lesson of the fire. That is the lesson that Rose Friedman carried for 90 years after the smoke cleared. We're almost at the end of this night. We started in the hold of a ship. We walked through buildings without windows. We hauled water up staircases. We sat at sewing machines. We organised boycotts and photographed darkness, and followed a child through a courtyard to a sick mother. We stood in the rain. We heard the pounding on a locked door. There is one more stop. The part of this story that brings us from 1911 to right now. What happened to those buildings? What happened to that neighbourhood? What happened to the people who came after? And what, if anything, of all this history still lives in the world we actually inhabit today? That is where we finish. At some point between 1920 and 1930, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with a single event or a single law, but gradually the way tides change so slowly you don't notice until you look back and realize the waterline is in a completely different place. The great wave of immigration slowed. The Immigration Act of 1924, officially known as the Johnson-Reed Act, essentially closed the door on the kind of mass movement that had built the Lower East Side. National origin quotas were imposed. The numbers dropped from the hundreds of thousands a year to a trickle, and without the constant flow of newly arriving families who needed the cheapest possible housing, the tenement economy began to change. The families who had scraped together enough to leave, and many had moved on, to Brooklyn, to the Bronx, to Queens, to New Jersey, wherever the next rung up the ladder happened to be. The buildings they left behind did not disappear. They stood there, as they stand today. I want to spend a moment with 97 Orchard Street because it is the most documented single address in this entire story, and what happened to it over time tells us something true about how history works. The building was condemned in 1935. The Multiple Dwellings Act required upgrades that the landlord, by then an absentee owner as they so often were, decided were not worth making. He evicted the remaining tenants. He sealed the residential floors. The storefronts at street level continued to operate, and the apartments above sat untouched for the next 50 years. 50 years. When a pair of researchers stumbled into the building in 1988, they found the apartments essentially as they had been left. Furniture, belongings, layers of wallpaper. Each layer a different family, a different era, a different set of decisions about what colour makes a room feel like home, when home is 3 rooms with no natural light. It was, as one person described it, a time capsule. The most perfectly preserved record of immigrant tenement life in New York City had survived not because anyone protected it, but because no one had bothered to tear it down. That building is now the Tenement Museum, and I find something quietly extraordinary about that fact. The people who lived in those apartments, the Levines with their garment shop, the Gumpert's family, the Rogaszewskis, the Baldizis, none of them built those rooms to be remembered. None of them imagined sewing collars onto shirtwaists by the light of a kerosene lamp at midnight that 150 years later people from around the world would pay to stand in the space where they had worked and lived and worried and hoped. They were just trying to get through the week, and yet here we are, paying attention, which is, when you think about it, the most powerful thing the living can offer to the dead. So what became of it all? What became of the people, the buildings, the neighborhood, the fierce crowded world that the Lower East Side was at its peak? The short answer is it became America. Not metaphorically, concretely. The children and grandchildren of the tenement families fanned out across the country. They became teachers, doctors, labor lawyers, scientists, writers, politicians. They carried with them the specific intellectual and cultural inheritance of those buildings, the habits of mind forged by poverty and community, and the constant negotiation between holding on to who you were and becoming something new. The American entertainment industry of the 20th century was built to a degree that surprises people when they see the statistics by the children of the Lower East Side. The American labor movement was built by the daughters and sons of those sewing rooms. The American food culture, the delicatessen, the pizza, the bagel was built in those tenement kitchens. Yiddish theatre thrived on 2nd Avenue for decades, drawing audiences from all over the city. The Forward newspaper, published in Yiddish, was at its peak the most widely read Jewish newspaper in the world, and beneath all of it, the deeper inheritance, the understanding deeply personal and deeply communal, that rights are not given. They are demanded. They are organized for. They are won through the specific patient, sometimes loud, sometimes dangerous work of people who decide that the current arrangement is not acceptable. That understanding, born in those buildings, tested in those factories, expressed in those boycotts and strikes and marches, is as American as any document or monument. But here is the part of the story that requires honesty. The neighborhood did not simply transform into prosperity and then stay there. The decades after World War II brought new pressures. Urban renewal, a policy movement that promised to replace slums with modern housing, tore through many immigrant neighborhoods with less care for what was being destroyed than the name implied. Public housing projects rose on cleared land. Some of them provided genuine improvements for a time. Many of them reproduced in concrete and steel many of the same problems the reformers had spent decades fighting: overcrowding, isolation, inadequate maintenance, the systematic neglect that comes when the people who make decisions do not live with the consequences. The Lower East Side itself went through decades of decline in the mid-20th century. Buildings that had housed thousands of people stood half empty. Poverty shifted and concentrated in new ways. The neighborhood changed hands multiple times, from Jewish families to Puerto Rican families to Chinese families, to most recently the arriving tide of young professionals and boutique hotels and restaurants with seasonal menus that the previous residents could never have afforded. This is called gentrification, and it is the part of this story where I feel the most conflicted, because the same forces that drove up the price of kosher meat in 1902 are now driving up the price of rent in neighborhoods that the descendants of the original tenement families can no longer afford. The mechanism is different. The logic is identical. The people most recently arrived, most economically vulnerable, most in need of affordable housing near their communities and their work, those people are still being compressed into whatever space the market decides is acceptable for them. Still having their windows measured not by human need but by profit margin. The buildings changed, the law changed, the specific forms of exploitation changed, but the underlying question, whose need matters and how much that question, has not been resolved. It has simply been re-asked in each generation in new languages by new arrivals in different buildings that have the same essential geometry. I've been thinking through all of this about what it means to pay attention to a history like this one, not to study it, to actually let it land. Because the tenement world is not some distant finished thing that happened to other people a long time ago. It is the world that produced the conditions of the one you're living in, the legal protections you rely on, the minimum wage, the fire exit, the window, the weekend. All of it was fought for by people who are tired and underpaid and living in 3 rooms with no running water, and who still found the energy to demand that things be different. What that requires is something that I do not think is teachable, but is recognizable when you see it. A refusal to accept that the current arrangement is the only possible arrangement, the willingness to say this is not adequate, and then the willingness which is much harder to act on that. Let me leave you with one more image, not a dark one. It is the summer of 1890-something. The exact year does not matter. Call it 1895. It is evening on the Lower East Side. The pushcarts have been pulled in. The factories are closed at least until tomorrow morning. The heat is still in the air the way it stays in those buildings long after sunset. And on the fire escapes, on every fire escape, on every building on the block, people are sitting. Families, couples, old men in shirt sleeves, young women in their best blouses talking to the neighbours on the fire escape above, children leaning through the railings watching the street below. Nobody down there has anything by the standard of what America was supposed to provide. No running water, no proper light, no security from the rent collector who will come on Friday. But they are outside, in the evening air, together, in a city that did not particularly want them, on fire escapes that were installed because reformers fought to make them mandatory, above streets that would become American memory, and someone, maybe a child, maybe a young man at the beginning of something, is looking at the skyline. That skyline. The thing that had appeared on the horizon when the ship came in and they thought, we made it. This is the place. This is where everything changes. And they were right. Just not in the way they imagined. Not easily. Not without cost. But they were right. And so we come to the end of tonight's journey. We've been inside this world for a long time now. We've walked through the buildings and felt the darkness. We've heard the machines and the children and the water being hauled up the stairs. We've sat at the table and tasted the soup made from almost nothing. We've stood in the rain and the smoke. We've read the names on a list of the dead. And I genuinely hope that this world feels a little more real to you now than it did when we started. Not as a history lesson, as a human story. The story of people who arrived with very little and built something extraordinary, not in spite of the difficulty but often because of it. The story of a city that was willing to take everything from its newest arrivals and somehow produced in these same cramped buildings the fiercest and most durable defenders of human dignity that American history has ever seen. The story of how the world you live in right now came to be. Thank you. I mean that genuinely, not in the way that people say thank you when they mean nothing particular by it, but because you chose to spend this time, this particular stretch of hours, when you could have been doing anything here with this story, with these people. That matters. These families from 130, 140 years ago, they left almost nothing behind in the conventional sense. No monuments, no portraits in museums, no streets named after them. What they left is the world, the specific shape of it, the specific rights contained in it, the specific foods on your table that came from their kitchens, the specific music that came from their streets, and a story, which is what we have been doing tonight, keeping it alive. If this journey meant something to you, if you found yourself at any point thinking about someone or something, or some moment in your own life that connected to what we talked about tonight, I would genuinely love to know. Leave a comment. Tell me what landed. Tell me what you were thinking about. Tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is and what this night feels like where you are. because that is the other half of what this channel is, not just the history I bring to you, but the conversation that history opens up between us. And if you are new here, if tonight was your first night in this company, I hope it was worth your time. There are many more nights like this one ahead, many more worlds to enter, many more people to meet, some of them famous, many of them not, all of them real, all of them worth knowing. So rest now. Let the stories settle. The tenement families of the Lower East Side, the ones who hauled the water and sang on the fire escapes and pounded on the locked doors and refused to be forgotten, they are not really gone. They are in the building codes, in the labour laws, in the food, in the music, in the way this city, this country continues to absorb wave after wave of new arrivals who come with nothing and build something anyway. That story is not over. It is happening right now, somewhere in this city, in a small apartment, with a family that arrived recently, that is trying to figure out how to survive and how to hold on to who they are and how to give their children something they themselves did not have. The tenement world did not end. It just moved to a different address. And the next time you see a fire escape on a building, or step into a modern apartment with a window in every room, or pick up a paycheck that reflects a minimum wage, or walk out of a building through an unlocked door, think of them, just for a moment, the people who made those things necessary, and the people who made those things real. Good night.